in the gentle darkness of your room as you settle into comfort and prepare for rest. Allow your mind to drift across time and space, back to the shores of the ancient Mediterranean. There, along a sun-drenched coast where the blue waters meet golden sand, once stood a city like no other, Alexandria, a place where the light was not just from the brilliant Mediterranean sun, but from the glow of human thought and understanding. As your breathing slows and deepens, imagine the soft lapping of waves against stone quays, the distant calls of merchants in half a dozen languages, and the whisper of papyrus being carefully unrolled beneath the warm glow of oil lamps. This is the world of the Great Library of Alexandria, perhaps humanity's first true attempt to gather all knowledge in one sacred space. Tonight, as you rest, I'll guide you through its entire story, from glorious beginning to mysterious end, and the echoes that still resonate in our world today. The rise and fall of this temple to human wisdom offers us not just historical knowledge, but a soothing perspective on our own brief moment in time. For even as empires rise and fall, as libraries burn and knowledge is reborn, there remains a continuity of human curiosity that spans the centuries and connects us all. If you enjoy falling asleep to these historical journeys through time, I'd love to know what other ancient mysteries and lost wonders might guide you toward peaceful dreams. Perhaps the hanging gardens of Babylon, or the silent corridors of Angkor Wat. Share your thoughts in the comments below. But for now, close your eyes and journey with me to Ptolemaic Egypt, where our story begins. Ptolemaic Egypt, the setting. The story of the Great Library cannot be told without first understanding the remarkable city that housed it, Alexandria, a jewel set carefully at the edge of the Mediterranean, where the life-giving waters of the Nile spill into the vast azure sea. The city was young, as ancient cities go, founded in 331 BCE by Alexander the Great himself during his world-changing campaign of conquest. Standing at what was then the edge of the known world, the young Macedonian king is said to have traced the outline of his new city in the sand, using barley meal to mark where mighty walls would one day stand. Perhaps he already dreamed of creating not just another military outpost, but a center of culture and learning that would bear his name across the centuries. Alexander would never see his vision realized. He moved eastward with his armies, and death found him in Babylon before his 33rd year. But the dream of Alexandria did not die with him. It fell to one of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy, to claim Egypt as his portion of Alexander's fractured empire, and under his guidance the city grew into something extraordinary. Try to imagine, as you rest comfortably, what it might have been like to approach Alexandria by sea in those early days of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Your ship would first glimpse the towering marble lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the ancient world's true engineering marvels. Standing perhaps 400 feet tall, its mirrored flames could be seen from nearly 30 miles out to sea, a comforting beacon guiding weary travelers to safe harbor. Below this wonder, the city would gradually take shape in your vision. White limestone buildings gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, the royal quarter with its palaces and gardens spread along the eastern harbour called Portus Magnus, or the Great Harbour. The air would carry to you a blend of scents both familiar and exotic. The tang of salt water, yes, but also frankincense from Arabia, spices from India, cedar from Lebanon, and the distinctive aroma of Egyptian cuisine wafting from countless cooking fires. As your vessel moved closer, the sounds would reach you too, the creaking of countless ships' timbers, the shouts of sailors in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and a dozen other tongues, the distant music of street performers, the calls of merchants selling their wares. Alexandria was a city of remarkable diversity, even by the cosmopolitan standards of the ancient Mediterranean. Under Ptolemy I Soter, the Saviour, and his descendants, the city became home to sizable communities of Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and eventually Romans, along with smaller groups of Persians, Nubians, Indians, and people from across Alexander's former empire. Unlike many ancient conquerors, the Ptolemaic rulers did not seek to erase local culture, but rather created a unique blend of Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside Greek deities, often merging them into syncretic forms like Serapis, a deity who combined aspects of Osiris and Zeus to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian subjects. The city itself reflected this cultural fusion in its very stones. Traditional Egyptian temples, with their massive pylons and hieroglyphic inscriptions, stood not far from Greek-style gymnasiums and theatres. In the agora, or marketplace, Egyptian farmers in traditional kilts sold their produce alongside Greek merchants in flowing chitons and himatians. The royal palace complex combined Greek architectural precision with Egyptian symbolic elements and decorative motifs. Even the language of the streets was a blend. Though Greek was the official language of administration and culture, Egyptian Demotic remained widely spoken, and many residents were bilingual or even trilingual. This was not merely a city of commerce and politics, though it excelled at both. Under Ptolemy I, and especially his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Alexandria was designed to be a beacon of culture and learning. The intellectual capital of the world. The Ptolemaic rulers understood something profound about power. True imperial might rested not just on military strength or economic prosperity, but on cultural achievement. To rule the known world, one needed to be seen as the caretaker of civilization itself. As night settled over the city, oil lamps would illuminate thousands of windows, their warm glow reflecting off the harbour waters. In the royal quarter, more elaborate lighting would reveal gardens with carefully imported plants from across the Mediterranean, fountains whose gentle splash provided relief from the Egyptian heat, and colonnaded walkways where philosophers and scholars strolled in evening conversation. Among these royal buildings, set slightly apart in its own sacred precinct, stood a complex that would change the course of human knowledge, the Museum and Library of Alexandria. The rhythms of Alexandrian life moved with the seasons and the hours. Mornings began early, with fishermen setting out before dawn, and markets opening as the first light touched the eastern sky. The heat of midday would bring a pause to many activities, with people retreating to the shade of courtyards or the coolness of stone buildings. Evenings brought renewed energy as the worst heat passed, with wealthy citizens attending symposia, intellectual drinking parties where ideas were exchanged alongside wine, while ordinary people gathered in taverns or public squares. Throughout it all, in every quarter of the city, conversation flowed. Ideas were Alexandria's most valuable currency. It was in this vibrant, complex setting that one of humanity's greatest intellectual adventures would unfold. As we transition from the broader context of Ptolemaic Alexandria to the specific vision that created the Great Library, imagine yourself walking the city's broad main street, the Canopic Way, moving from the bustle and noise of the port toward the more serene royal quarter. The sounds of commerce gradually fade, replaced by the measured footsteps of guards and officials. The air grows cooler, scented now with garden flowers and the distinctive smell of fresh papyrus. You are approaching the intellectual heart of the ancient world, the place where the vision of the Great Library would soon be realized. The creation of the Great Library was not a sudden inspiration, but the culmination of evolving Greek traditions of learning and knowledge preservation. For centuries before Alexandria, Greek cities had maintained collections of scrolls, often housed in temples or civic buildings. In Athens, Aristotle had established his Lyceum with its substantial collection of texts for teaching and research. Yet what would emerge in Alexandria would surpass all previous efforts in both scale and ambition. The vision for the library is traditionally attributed to Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian philosopher and politician who had studied with Aristotle and later fled to Egypt when he fell from power in Athens. Finding refuge at the court of Ptolemy the Soter around 297 BCE, Demetrius became a trusted advisor to the king. In long conversations that must have stretched into the Mediterranean nights, Demetrius is said to have suggested a bold idea to the aging ruler: not just a library, but a universal library, one that would gather copies of all the world's books under a single roof. Imagine these two men, one a battle-hardened general who had ridden alongside Alexander through the dust of conquered kingdoms, the other a philosopher-statesman steeped in the intellectual traditions of Athens, sitting in a palace garden as the evening cooled the Egyptian air. Between them, perhaps a table with wine cups and oil lamps, casting gentle light on their faces as they discussed a dream that seemed both impossible and irresistible: to create a single place where all human knowledge could be gathered, organized, and studied. For Ptolemy, the appeal was not purely intellectual. As a ruler establishing a new dynasty in a foreign land, he understood the power of cultural prestige. Alexandria was already becoming a commercial powerhouse thanks to its strategic location, but trade alone did not make a city great in the eyes of the Mediterranean world. Athens, despite its political decline, still commanded immense respect for its philosophical and literary achievements. By establishing Alexandria as the new center of learning, Ptolemy could enhance his dynasty's legitimacy and Egypt's standing among nations. The practical implementation of this vision likely began during the reign of Ptolemy I, but it was his son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who would expand it into the wonder we remember. Taking the throne around 283 BCE, Ptolemy II embraced the library project with extraordinary enthusiasm and resources. Under his patronage, two interconnected institutions took shape: the Mouseion, or museum, literally Shrine of the Muses, and the library itself. The Mouseion was conceived as a research institute and cultural centre dedicated to the 9 muses who, in Greek tradition, inspired all forms of art and knowledge. Unlike modern museums, it did not primarily display objects for public viewing. Rather, it was a community of scholars, perhaps the world's first true research university. Here, learned men, and they were, with rare exceptions, men were given stipends by the royal treasury, freeing them from ordinary work to focus entirely on intellectual pursuits. They ate together in a great dining hall, walked together in colonnaded gardens, and engaged in the endless conversations through which knowledge grows. Connected to the scholarly community was the library itself, the vast collection of texts that would become the envy of the ancient world. From the beginning, the Ptolemies implemented an ambitious acquisition policy. Royal agents were dispatched throughout the Mediterranean world with substantial funds to purchase books wherever they could be found. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour were searched not for contraband but for texts. Any books on board were confiscated, copied by the library scribes, and then, at least in theory, returned to their owners. Letters were sent to rulers across the known world, requesting that they share copies of important works from their own territories. Perhaps most famously, Ptolemy III Euergetes is said to have borrowed the official Athenian copies of the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Irreplaceable state treasures, posting the enormous sum of 15 talents as security. Once the plays reached Alexandria, he chose to forfeit the deposit, keeping the originals for his library and sending back only copies to the outraged Athenians. Whether the story is entirely true or embellished in the telling, it captures something essential about the Ptolemaic approach to knowledge acquisition. Their determination knew few limits, ethical or financial. As you drift towards sleep, try to envision the physical activity involved in this unprecedented gathering of texts. Imagine merchants and sailors arriving at the harbour, their vessels searched by royal officials looking not for smuggled goods, but for written words. Picture the careful unpacking of papyrus scrolls, some fresh and new, others worn with age and handling, in the library's receiving rooms. Follow in your mind the journey of a newly arrived text, examined by scholars who would determine its authenticity and value, carried to scribes who would create a precise copy for the collection, perhaps translated from Babylonian, Hebrew, or Egyptian into Greek, the library's primary language. The process of copying itself was painstaking work, requiring extraordinary precision. In a quiet room with good light, a scribe would sit with the original text and a fresh scroll of papyrus. Using a reed pen dipped in ink made from soot, gum, and water, he would carefully reproduce each line, each word, each character. A single long work might require months of such careful labor. The epic poems of Homer, for instance, would fill many scrolls, each requiring its own meticulous attention. No mechanical reproduction existed. Each copy was the product of human eyes, hands, and concentration. The commitment to this vision was reflected in the resources allocated to it. While exact figures are impossible to know with certainty, ancient sources suggest the library eventually held anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 papyrus scrolls, an almost unimaginable achievement in an age of handwritten texts. The annual budget for acquisitions and operations would have been enormous, a testament to the Ptolemaic dynasty's genuine belief in the value of this cultural investment. Beyond mere accumulation, the Ptolemies insisted on organization and accessibility, hallmarks of a true library rather than merely a collection. Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar who worked in the library, created the Pennaches, tables, often considered the world's first library catalogue. This monumental work, extending to 120 scrolls itself, organized the collection by subject and author, creating a navigable system for finding specific works within the vast holdings. What emerged from these efforts was not just a building filled with scrolls, but a new approach to knowledge itself. The library embodied a radical idea: that human understanding could be comprehensive, that the world's wisdom could be gathered in one place and made accessible to inquiring minds. This notion that knowledge is not the exclusive property of temples or priestly castes or distant cultures, but a common heritage to be collected and shared, represents one of Alexandria's most profound contributions to intellectual history. As night settled over the city and the oil lamps of the library burned late into the darkness, scholars would move among the shelves and reading rooms, engaged in the work of understanding their world. Some sought specific information: astronomical observations from Babylon, mathematical theorems from Greece, medical knowledge from Egypt. Others pursued broader questions about the nature of reality, the structure of language, or the patterns of the stars. All were participating, whether they knew it or not, in a revolutionary experiment: the deliberate creation of an intellectual community with resources beyond anything the world had previously seen. As we leave the founding vision and move toward the physical reality of the library complex, imagine yourself standing at the entrance to the sanctuary of knowledge. The bustle of Alexandrian streets fades behind you. Before you rise, elegant columns framing a doorway that opens into cool, shaded spaces where thousands of scrolls await. You are about to step into one of history's greatest monuments to human curiosity, a place where architecture itself was designed to serve the life of the mind. As you approach the library complex from the colonnaded street, the first impression is one of dignified harmony rather than ostentatious grandeur. Unlike the massive temples of earlier Egyptian dynasties, with their overwhelming scale meant to humble mortal visitors, the library and Malsion complex was designed on a more human scale, impressive without being intimidating, its beauty lying in proportion and balance rather than sheer size. This was architecture that reflected Greek aesthetic principles, adapted to Egyptian sunshine and materials. The entire complex was likely situated within the Bruchion, the royal quarter of Alexandria, though its exact location remains a subject of scholarly debate. Archaeological evidence is frustratingly limited, as modern Alexandria sits atop its ancient predecessor, and centuries of rebuilding, earthquakes, and rising sea levels have obscured much of the physical record. What we know comes largely from ancient descriptions, passing references in historical texts, and reasonable inferences about similar Hellenistic structures. The Mausion portion of the complex probably centered around a peristyle courtyard, an open space surrounded by columns creating a shaded walkway. This architectural form, common throughout the Hellenistic world, created a microclimate of relative coolness in the Egyptian heat, while allowing for abundant natural light. Imagine the gentle sound of a central fountain playing in this courtyard, water droplets catching the Mediterranean sunlight as scholars walked in quiet conversation beneath the colonnade. Opening onto this courtyard would be various spaces dedicated to specific functions of the Mausion lecture rooms, where senior scholars might instruct students or present new ideas to colleagues. Dining facilities where the community took meals together, continuing their intellectual exchanges over food and wine, perhaps specialized areas for astronomical observation or anatomical study. There may have been a shrine to the Muses themselves, the divine patronesses of intellectual and artistic pursuits in Greek tradition. Connected to this scholarly complex, but forming its own distinct section, was the library proper. The vast repository of scrolls that gave Alexandria its reputation as the center of learning. The main reading room likely featured high ceilings to allow heat to rise away from readers and scrolls alike, with clerestory windows admitting indirect light that would illuminate texts without subjecting them to damaging direct sunlight. Imagine the quality of this light: diffused, gentle, casting no harsh shadows, perfect for hours of reading without strain. Around the periphery of this central space would be a system of shelves, or, more accurately, pigeonholes and niches built into the walls. Here, the scrolls would be stored, each in its own cylindrical case made of wood or leather, protecting the delicate papyrus within. These cases might bear small tags or labels identifying the work contained inside, author, title, and perhaps a classification symbol corresponding to the library's cataloguing system. The overall effect would have been quite different from a modern library with its freestanding shelves. Alexandria's collection likely lined the walls, with the center of rooms reserved for tables where readers could work. Beneath these public spaces, recent archaeological theories suggest there may have been extensive basement storerooms for the bulk of the collection. Climate control, a critical concern in Egypt's heat, would have been easier to maintain in subterranean chambers where temperatures remain more stable. If this theory is correct, the visible portion of the library might have held only a fraction of its treasures, with librarians retrieving additional materials from storage as scholars requested them. The physical form of these texts bears contemplating as we imagine the space. A book, in ancient Alexandria, was not the bound codex familiar to us today, but a scroll typically made from papyrus, a paper-like material created from the pith of the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta. A single work might require several scrolls, each perhaps 30 feet in length when unrolled, but stored tightly wound around a wooden rod with a protective case. Reading required both hands, one to unroll the beginning of the scroll, the other to roll up the portion already read. This physical reality shaped both the architecture of reading spaces and the experience of engaging with texts. The organization of this vast collection represented perhaps the library's greatest innovation. Callimachus's Pinakes divided works first into broad categories: rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, history, medicine, mathematics, natural science, and miscellaneous. Within these categories, works were arranged alphabetically by author. Each entry in this massive catalogue included the opening words of the work, its author, birthplace, father's name, educational background, and other identifying information, creating what we would now recognize as the first systematic bibliographic metadata. This system allowed scholars to locate specific works among the hundreds of thousands of scrolls. A researcher interested in, say, dramatic works from a particular region or time period could consult the Pinakes, identify relevant scrolls, and request them from library attendants. This seemingly obvious approach to organizing knowledge was revolutionary in its time. Previous collections had often been arranged simply by acquisition date or by arbitrary decisions of whoever maintained them. Beyond the main collection, specialized rooms likely housed particularly valuable or fragile materials. Rare original manuscripts, like those obtained from Athens, would merit special protection from damage. Works in progress by the library's own scholars might have dedicated space. Maps, astronomical charts, and other non-textual materials would require special storage solutions. There may even have been a scriptorium, a dedicated facility where scribes worked to copy newly acquired texts or replace worn ones, though evidence for this specific feature remains limited. The sensory experience of moving through these spaces would have been distinctive. The predominant sound would be silence, but not complete stillness. The gentle rustle of papyrus being unrolled, the soft padding of sandaled feet across stone floors, occasional murmured conversations between scholars, perhaps the distant sound of a lecture or discussion from an adjoining room. The air would carry the distinctive scent of papyrus and ink, the faint aroma of the cedar oil sometimes used to protect scrolls from insects, perhaps a trace of incense from a nearby shrine, or the clean smell of limestone warmed by the Egyptian sun. The tactile experience would center on materials chosen for both beauty and function. Cool marble floors that kept the building comfortable even in summer heat. Wooden reading tables polished smooth by generations of scholarly elbows. The slightly rough texture of papyrus beneath the fingertips. The smooth wooden handles of scroll rods. Colors would be dominated by the warm ivory tone of papyrus, the terracotta of storage vessels, the varied browns of wooden fixtures, and the clean white of limestone walls, perhaps with selective use of painted decoration in key areas. Light would vary throughout the day, shifting as the sun moved across the Egyptian sky. Morning light might enter from eastern-facing windows, cool and clear. Midday would see the building relying on its architectural features to manage the intense Mediterranean sunshine. Late afternoon would bring warm golden light from the west, and evening would transition to the softer illumination of oil lamps placed carefully to allow continued reading without risking fire among the precious scrolls. The library was likely designed to accommodate different modes of scholarly work. Some spaces would allow for solitary reading and reflection, with individual tables spaced for privacy. Others might facilitate collaborative work, with larger surfaces where several scholars could examine a text together. There might be areas designated for dictation, where an author could speak his work to a scribe, or small rooms for discussion of sensitive or complex topics requiring concentration without distraction. As you mentally inhabit this space, this temple of knowledge created through unprecedented resources and ambition, consider how its very architecture embodied philosophical values. The balance between public and private spaces reflected the Greek ideal of knowledge as both a communal and individual pursuit. The organization system demonstrated a belief that the world's information could be rationally categorized and accessed. The physical centralization of texts from disparate cultures in one location embodied the cosmopolitan Hellenistic belief that wisdom transcended ethnic and political boundaries. The library complex was not static throughout its existence. It likely evolved over the centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The original structure may have been expanded as the collection grew. Specialized wings might have been added for new fields of study. Repairs and renovations would have been necessary, as Alexandria's humid climate took its toll on building materials. What began under Ptolemy I and flourished under Ptolemy II would continue to develop under their successors, each adding their own contributions to this living monument to human knowledge. As we transition from the physical structure to the daily activities that took place within it, imagine yourself sitting at one of those ancient reading tables as the quality of light suggests early morning. Around you, the library is coming to life, attendants moving quietly to open shutters, scholars beginning to arrive, the first scrolls of the day being carefully placed on reading tables. The architecture has created the vessel. Now it will be filled with the quiet intensity of human minds at work. Dawn breaks gently over Alexandria, the first rays of Mediterranean sunlight illuminating the lighthouse of Pharos before spilling across the city's white limestone buildings. Within the library complex, the day begins well before most citizens have risen from their beds. A small staff of attendants, many of them slaves owned by the Ptolemaic state, arrive in the pre-dawn darkness to prepare the spaces for the day's scholarly activities. Oil lamps that have burned through the night are extinguished, shutters are opened to admit the fresh morning air, floors are swept, water basins are filled for the comfort of readers who will spend long hours among the scrolls. As the sun rises higher, the scholars themselves begin to appear, men in Greek Haitians or Egyptian linens, distinguished by their measured pace and often by the servant walking behind them carrying writing implements and personal scrolls. Some have been associated with the Mausion for decades, their faces familiar to every attendant. Others are visitors from distant cities, drawn by the library's unparalleled reputation. They arrive with the focused expressions of those who have awakened, already thinking about the intellectual problems that await them. A typical day for a resident scholar might begin with a light meal taken in the Mausion's communal dining hall. Here, over bread, figs, and watered wine, the first conversations of the day would unfold. Reports of progress made the day before, discussions of difficulties encountered in a particular text, friendly debates about points of interpretation. The Ptolemies had established a tradition whereby scholars lived and ate together at public expense, creating a community where intellectual exchange continued beyond formal research hours. Following this morning meal, the serious work of the day would commence. For many, this meant proceeding to the reading rooms of the library itself. Imagine a scholar, let us call him Apollonius, approaching one of the library attendants with a specific request. Perhaps he is working on a commentary of Homer's Iliad and needs to compare different versions of a particularly difficult passage. Speaking quietly to avoid disturbing others already at work, he makes his request, specifying exactly which scrolls he requires. The attendant, likely a slave with specialized training in the library's organization system, would consult the relevant section of Callimachus's Pinakes to determine the exact location of the requested works. Then, moving through the storage areas with practiced efficiency, he would retrieve the cylindrical scroll cases and deliver them to Apollonius's reading table. There, the scholar would carefully extract the papyrus rolls, placing weights at either end to keep them flat as he studied the text. The physical act of reading in ancient Alexandria was more demanding than our modern experience. The text on a papyrus scroll ran in columns, usually without spaces between words or standardized punctuation. Reading was typically done aloud, even when reading privately. A gentle murmur of scholarly voices would be a constant background sound in the library's reading rooms. To find a specific passage, one had to physically unroll the scroll until reaching the desired section, a process far less convenient than flipping through pages of a codex. As Apollonius studies his Homeric texts, comparing variants and making notes on his own writing tablet, other scholars throughout the building are engaged in similarly focused work. In one corner, an astronomer consults Babylonian star charts, comparing their observations with Egyptian celestial records and his own recent sightings. Nearby, A physician studies anatomical descriptions from various medical traditions, perhaps preparing for a practical dissection session later in the day. A mathematician works through a geometric proof, drawing figures in sand spread on a special table designed for this purpose. Not all scholarly work happened within the library walls. By mid-morning, when the Mediterranean sun had risen high enough to make outdoors comfortable but not yet oppressively hot, some scholars might move to the peristyle courtyard or gardens of the Mausion. Here, walking slowly beneath colonnades or sitting on stone benches among flowering plants, they would engage in the peripatetic tradition inherited from Aristotle teaching, discussing and developing ideas through conversation rather than solitary reading. Imagine two philosophers pacing these gardens, deep in discussion about the nature of the soul, gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point. Nearby, a senior scholar might be surrounded by several younger men, explaining a difficult concept from a text they had all been assigned to read. The sound of these conversations would blend with natural noises: birdsong, the splash of fountains, the rustle of papyrus reeds planted as both decoration and reminder of the material that made the library's existence possible. As midday approached, bringing the most intense heat, many would retreat indoors once more. This might be a time for writing rather than reading, capturing the morning's insights before they faded. Ancient writing implements were more cumbersome than our modern pens and paper. A scholar would typically use a wooden tablet covered with wax, into which letters were scratched using a pointed stylus. This temporary medium allowed for corrections and revisions. Only when satisfied with a text would one go through the more laborious process of committing it to papyrus with ink. The afternoon might bring more formally structured activities. The Mausion likely hosted regular lectures where established scholars presented their work to colleagues or instructed students in specialized subjects. These would not have resembled modern university lectures with large audiences. They would be more intimate affairs, with frequent interruptions for questions and discussion. Imagine a small room where perhaps 20 men sit or stand around a central figure who reads from his own work, pausing frequently to elaborate on difficult points or respond to challenges from his listeners. Specialized research activities would continue throughout the day. The Alexandrian library was not merely a repository of texts, but a center for active knowledge creation. Astronomical observations might be conducted from dedicated platforms. Medical researchers might perform dissections, both animal and, controversially, human. Botanical specimens from across the known world would be studied and catalogued. Mathematical problems would be posed and solved. Linguistic studies would compare and analyze different languages. As the afternoon waned, some scholars would seek refreshment and relaxation. The Ptolemies provided not only intellectual resources, but physical comforts for their academic community. Bathing facilities, possibly including a gymnasium in the Greek tradition, would allow scholars to refresh their bodies after hours of mental exertion. Some might take this opportunity to participate in the Greek ideal of balanced development, exercising the body as well as the mind. Evening would bring another communal meal, likely more substantial than breakfast, and accompanied by wine. The dining hall would fill with animated conversation as the day's discoveries and frustrations were shared. These symposium-like gatherings, while more restrained than the sometimes raucous drinking parties depicted in Greek literature, nevertheless played a vital role in the intellectual life of the institution. Ideas that had germinated in solitary study during the day would be tested in the crucible of dinner conversation, challenged and refined by colleagues. After this evening meal, as darkness fell completely over Alexandria, some scholars would retire to their quarters. Others, particularly dedicated or facing pressing deadlines, might return to the library itself, where oil lamps would be lit to allow continued work into the night hours. These nocturnal scholars would be a smaller group, moving quietly among the shadowed shelves, perhaps feeling a special intimacy with the ancient wisdom housed in scrolls visible now only in the small circles of lamplight. Through all these daily activities ran invisible but important social hierarchies. The most senior scholars, those with established reputations or special favour from the Ptolemaic court, would enjoy privileges unavailable to others. Priority access to rare texts, larger private workspaces, perhaps servants assigned specifically to assist their research. Visiting scholars might find themselves somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, their treatment depending on their reputation and the value placed on their particular expertise. At the lower levels would be younger scholars still proving themselves, along with the numerous slaves and freedmen who performed the essential tasks of scroll retrieval, copying, and facility maintenance. Women were largely absent from the scholarly community, reflecting the gender restrictions common throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The notable exception was Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher who lived during Alexandria's later period, circa 355 to 415 CE, long after the Ptolemaic dynasty had ended. During the library's prime under the Ptolemies, the scholarly community remained overwhelmingly male, though some evidence suggests women might occasionally have accessed texts through male relatives or intermediaries. The rhythm of days was overlaid with the rhythm of seasons. Alexandria's climate, while milder than the Egyptian interior, still featured distinct seasonal variations that affected daily life at the library. Winter brought cooler temperatures and occasional rain, perhaps limiting outdoor discussions but making indoor work more comfortable. The intense heat of summer would have posed challenges for both humans and papyrus scrolls, requiring careful management of ventilation and humidity. Seasonal festivals and royal events would periodically interrupt the scholarly routine, particularly when the Mausion's intellectuals were expected to participate in court ceremonies or compose works celebrating Ptolemaic achievements. Through this daily pattern of focused study, collegial discussion, formal teaching, and communal dining, the Library of Alexandria created something unprecedented, a sustainable ecosystem of intellectual activity where knowledge was not merely preserved but actively developed. Scholars built upon each other's work, challenged established ideas, synthesized disparate traditions, and slowly, methodically expanded the boundaries of human understanding. As night finally settles over our imagined day at the library, picture the building growing quiet once more. Most scholars have retired. Only a few oil lamps still flicker in reading rooms where particularly dedicated individuals continue their work. The attendants move silently, ensuring that scrolls have been properly returned to their storage niches, that no lamps are being left where they might pose a fire hazard, that water basins are ready for the next day's users. Outside, the Mediterranean stars shine over Alexandria, the same stars that the library's astronomers study with such care. In a few hours, dawn will come again, and the cycle of scholarly life will resume, as it did day after day for centuries, creating the intellectual legacy we still honor today. As we leave the daily rhythms of the library behind, let us turn our attention to what filled those countless scrolls, the remarkable collection that drew scholars from across the ancient world and established Alexandria as the preeminent center of learning for generations. As you rest comfortably, imagine standing before the vast collection that once filled the great library of Alexandria, hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, each carefully stored in its protective cylindrical case, each containing a fragment of human knowledge preserved in ink and fibre. The precise size of this collection has been debated since antiquity. The smallest estimates suggest 40,000 scrolls, while the most ambitious claims speak of 700,000 or more. Most modern scholars suggest a middle ground of perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 scrolls at the library's peak, an extraordinary achievement in an age when each text had to be copied by hand. Understanding the true scope of this collection requires adjusting our modern expectations. A book, in ancient Alexandria, did not correspond exactly to what we would call a book today. Lengthy works were divided across multiple scrolls, each scroll containing what we might consider several chapters. Homer's Iliad, for instance, might occupy 24 separate scrolls, one for each book of the epic. Conversely, shorter works by the same author might be combined onto a single scroll for efficient storage. When ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands of scrolls, we must remember that this does not translate directly into the same number of distinct works. Nevertheless, the ambition behind the collection was clear: to gather all significant written knowledge under one roof. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, is said to have sent letters to rulers throughout the known world, requesting that they send copies of important works from their territories. Scholars were dispatched to markets across the Mediterranean and Near East with royal funds to purchase any valuable texts they could find. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour were searched not for contraband, but for books, which were confiscated, copied, and returned, though some accounts suggest the originals were often kept while owners received the copies. The collection's content spanned the entire breadth of ancient knowledge, organized by Ptolemaic into categories that still influence library classification today. Let us explore each major section of this remarkable intellectual treasury, moving through the library as an ancient visitor might, guided by the Pinakes, the world's first comprehensive library catalogue. First would come the works of poetry and literature, the foundation of Greek education and culture. Homer's epics would occupy a place of special prominence, represented by numerous copies reflecting different textual traditions from various Greek cities. The Alexandrian scholars, particularly Zenodotus of Ephesus, the library's first official head, and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, devoted enormous effort to creating authoritative editions of these foundational texts, comparing variants and eliminating what they judged to be later editions. Alongside Homer would be other epic poets, Hesiod with his Theogony and Works and Days, the now largely lost poems of the epic cycle that told other stories of the Trojan War, and works from non-Greek traditions as well. The dramatic literature section would contain the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the cornerstone of Athenian cultural achievement, along with the comedies of Aristophanes, Menander, and others. The library famously possessed the original state copies of these plays from Athens, obtained through Ptolemy III's controversial borrowing and copying scheme. These texts were particularly valuable because they represented official versions performed at Athens' dramatic festivals, rather than potentially corrupted actors' copies that circulated more widely. Lyric and elegiac poetry would fill many scrolls. The works of Sappho from Lesbos with her intense personal verses, Pindar's elaborate victory odes, Simonides' elegies, and many others whose works now survive only in fragments. The library likely contained complete collections of poets known to us today, only through scattered quotations preserved by later writers. Moving to prose works, history would form a substantial portion of the collection. Herodotus's wide-ranging account of the Persian Wars and the cultures of the known world, Thucydides' methodical analysis of the Peloponnesian War, Xenophon's continuation of that history and his account of the expedition of the 10,000, the works of Ctesias on Persian history, and numerous local histories of individual cities and regions would all be carefully preserved. Of particular significance would be the histories of Alexander's campaigns, written by participants like Ptolemy I himself, Callisthenes, and Aristobulus. Accounts now lost to us except through later quotations and adaptations. Alexandria's collection of philosophical texts would be unparalleled, beginning with pre-Socratic thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, whose works were already rare by the Hellenistic period. The complete dialogues of Plato would be present, along with the extensive works of Aristotle, possibly including esoteric texts not intended for wide circulation. Works of the major Hellenistic philosophical schools would be well represented, Stoic writings of Zeno and Chrysippus, Epicurean texts by Epicurus and his followers, skeptical works from the Academy under Arcesilaus and Carneades. Beyond Greek philosophy, the library likely contained translations or summaries of philosophical traditions from Egypt, Judea, Babylon, and possibly even India, with which the Ptolemaic kingdom had diplomatic and trade connections. Scientific and mathematical works formed another crucial section of the collection. Euclid's Elements, composed in Alexandria itself, would be there in its original form, alongside works of earlier mathematicians like Pythagoras, Theaetetus, and Eudoxus, whose contributions are now known mainly through references in later texts. Astronomical observations from Babylon, covering centuries of careful star-watching, would be available alongside Greek theoretical astronomy from figures like Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system nearly 1800 years before Copernicus. Medical texts would range from the Hippocratic corpus to Egyptian healing traditions and possibly Ayurvedic materials from India. Alexandria became particularly famous for its medical school, which benefited enormously from this comparative collection. Geographical knowledge would be extensively documented through both texts and maps. Hecataeus's early attempts at world geography, Pytheas's controversial account of voyages into the North Atlantic, reports from Ptolemaic exploratory expeditions up the Nile and along the Red Sea coast, all would provide a comprehensive view of the known world. Maps showing different conceptions of land masses and oceans would be available for comparison, along with itineraries describing coastal features and inland routes essential for trade and military movement. Technical works on subjects ranging from architecture to agriculture, mining to metallurgy would preserve practical knowledge from across the Mediterranean and Near East. Military treatises on tactics, siegecraft, and naval operations would sit alongside manuals on animal husbandry, crop rotation, and irrigation techniques. Works on shipbuilding from Phoenician traditions might be found next to Greek texts on temple construction or Egyptian guides to monumental architecture. Literary criticism, a field that came into its own at Alexandria, would occupy many scrolls. The library's scholars pioneered systematic approaches to textual analysis, authenticity questions, and interpretive methods. Works attributed to Homer were scrutinized for consistency of language and style. Plays were examined for structural patterns. The evolution of dialect forms across Greek literature was carefully documented. Much of what we now consider philological method originated in the work of Alexandrian scholars studying their vast textual resources. Religious texts would span an extraordinary range of traditions. Greek hymns and ritual instructions, Egyptian temple texts and funerary literature, Jewish scriptures, the Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew religious texts, was reportedly created in Alexandria. Zoroastrian materials from Persia, mystery cult initiation texts, all would be gathered as cultural documents worthy of preservation and study. The library's approach was notably secular by the standards of its time. These religious materials were treated as objects of scholarly interest rather than texts requiring special handling or restricted access. Perhaps most poignantly, the collection would include now lost works that we know only through references. The missing plays that would complete the trilogies of Aeschylus, Aristotle's dialogues written for the general public, the complete poems of Sappho rather than the fragments we possess, accurate eyewitness accounts of Alexander's campaigns, and countless works by authors whose names have faded entirely from historical memory. Beyond Greek materials, the library contained works from numerous linguistic traditions reflecting Alexandria's cosmopolitan character. Egyptian texts, some preserving traditions thousands of years old, would be available in both their original hieroglyphic or demotic forms and in Greek translations. Carthaginian writings on agriculture and navigation, Babylonian astronomical and mathematical works, Sanskrit philosophical texts, and materials from dozens of other cultures would be gathered and often translated, creating unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural intellectual exchange. The collection was not static, but grew continuously throughout the Ptolemaic period. New works produced by scholars within the Mauseion would be added to the library's holdings. Contemporary writings from across the Mediterranean would be acquired as they gained recognition. The Ptolemy's agents maintained an active acquisition program, always seeking to fill gaps in the collection or obtain better copies of important works. Particularly valuable were what we might now call primary sources, official documents, original manuscripts, or specially commissioned copies of important works. The library possessed state copies of tragedies performed at Athens, original Olympic victor lists, official decrees from various Greek cities, and other materials with special authenticity or authority. These would be prioritized for preservation, with copies made to protect the originals from excessive handling. The physical condition of these materials varied considerably. Some scrolls would be relatively new, created by the library's own scribes as preservation copies of older texts. Others might be centuries old, perhaps showing signs of wear, damage from humidity, or insect activity. The library staff developed preservation techniques including cedar oil treatments to deter insects and careful storage practices to minimize environmental damage. When scrolls became too fragile for regular use, fresh copies would be made before the originals deteriorated beyond recovery. Each scroll typically began with a title tag, syllabos, providing basic identification information, author, title, and sometimes a brief content summary. This practical feature allowed librarians to identify scrolls without needing to unroll each one. More extensive metadata would be found in the Pinakas, which provided detailed information about authors and their works, including biographical details that helped distinguish between writers with similar names, an early form of authority control still essential in modern library science. As you envision this vast collection, consider what it meant for a scholar to have access to these resources. Before Alexandria, a philosopher or scientist typically worked with whatever texts they could personally acquire or borrow, perhaps a few dozen scrolls at most. At Alexandria, that same scholar could consult hundreds or thousands of relevant works, comparing different traditions, identifying patterns across diverse sources, and building new knowledge on a foundation far broader than previously possible. For example, imagine an astronomer attempting to predict a lunar eclipse. In Alexandria, they could consult Babylonian observations covering centuries, Egyptian records of similar phenomena, Greek theoretical models of celestial motion, and perhaps even Chinese or Indian astronomical traditions, all gathered in one place, much of it translated into a common language. This unprecedented concentration of knowledge enabled intellectual leaps that would have been impossible in more limited contexts. As night deepens around you and sleep draws nearer, picture the quiet shelves of the great library holding these treasures of human thought and creativity. Poetry that could move listeners to tears or laughter. Philosophical investigations of the nature of reality, knowledge, and ethics. Mathematical proofs of elegant precision. Astronomical observations tracking the dance of planets across the night sky. Each scroll represented countless hours of human effort. The original composition, the careful copying, the scholarly annotation, the cataloguing and preservation. Each contained a thread in the vast tapestry of human understanding that the library sought to gather and protect. And each offered the possibility that, when placed in the hands of a perceptive reader, it might spark new connections, new questions, and new knowledge. As we transition from considering the collection itself to the remarkable individuals who studied these materials, imagine the gentle transition from one reading room to another within the library complex. The scrolls remain in their protective niches as we shift our focus to the minds that engaged with them. The brilliant scholars who made Alexandria not just a repository of past wisdom, but a generator of new insights that would shape the course of human thought for centuries to come. In the gentle stillness of night, as your thoughts drift along the corridors of the ancient library, let us turn our attention to the remarkable individuals who once walked these halls, the scholars whose brilliant minds transformed Alexandria from a mere collection of texts into the intellectual powerhouse of the ancient world. These were not simply caretakers of knowledge, but pioneers who expanded the boundaries of human understanding across nearly every field of inquiry. The library and Mausoleum attracted exceptional thinkers from across the Mediterranean world and beyond, drawn by the unprecedented resources and the opportunity to work alongside fellow scholars of the highest caliber. Under the patronage of the Ptolemies, these individuals enjoyed rare privileges, financial support that freed them from ordinary economic concerns, access to the world's greatest collection of texts, and a community of peers with whom to share and refine ideas. The result was an intellectual flowering that has few parallels in human history. Among the earliest luminaries associated with the library was Euclid, whose work on geometry remains foundational to mathematics over 2,000 years later. Arriving in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, Euclid synthesized and systematized earlier Greek mathematical knowledge into his Elements, 13 books that built the entire edifice of geometry from a few simple axioms through rigorous logical proof. Imagine Euclid in one of the library's teaching spaces, perhaps drawing geometric figures in a sand table as students gathered around, guiding them through the elegant reasoning that leads from first principles to complex theorems. When one student reportedly asked what practical use might come from studying geometry, Euclid is said to have instructed his slave to give the young man a coin, since he must make gain from what he learns. This anecdote captures something essential about the Alexandrian intellectual approach. Knowledge was valued for its own sake, not merely for practical application, though practical benefits often followed from theoretical understanding. Not long after Euclid came, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, perhaps the most versatile intellect of his age. Appointed as the library's third head librarian around 245 BCE, Eratosthenes exemplified the breadth of scholarship that Alexandria made possible. He was a mathematician who developed a method for identifying prime numbers, the sieve of Eratosthenes, still taught in schools today, a geographer who created one of the first systematic maps of the known world, a poet and literary critic who wrote on the Old Comedy, an astronomer who devised a calendar including leap years. Most famously, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of shadows at two different locations and the distance between them. On the summer solstice at noon, he observed that in Sian, modern Aswan, the sun shone directly to the bottom of a deep well, casting no shadow. At the same moment in Alexandria, approximately 800 kilometers to the north, a vertical pillar cast a shadow at about 2 degrees. By understanding this as evidence that Alexandria and Sian were on the same meridian but at different latitudes on a spherical Earth, Eratosthenes calculated our planet's circumference at about 252,000 stadia, remarkably close to the modern measurement, depending on which ancient stadian length is used for conversion. Picture Eratosthenes at work, perhaps in the early morning, measuring the shadow of a precisely positioned pillar in Alexandria. Later that day, carefully calculating proportions on papyrus, consulting with colleagues about the exact distance to Sian, and finally, after meticulous work, producing a figure that would not be improved upon for over 1,000 years. This combination of careful observation, mathematical reasoning, and systematic method exemplified the Alexandrian approach to knowledge. Another intellectual giant who spent time in Alexandria was Archimedes of Syracuse, though his association with the library was likely as a visitor rather than a permanent resident. Nevertheless, he almost certainly studied there in his youth and maintained connections with Alexandrian scholars throughout his life. His brilliant work on geometry, mechanics, and physics included determining the value of pi, establishing the principles of leverage and buoyancy, and developing ingenious devices including compound pulleys and the water screw that still bears his name. The perhaps apocryphal story of Archimedes leaping from his bath and running naked through the streets shouting, "Eureka! I have found it! I have found it!" after realizing how to test the purity of a golden crown captures the excitement of discovery that characterized Alexandrian intellectual life at its best. Whether in Alexandria itself or in constant dialogue with its scholars, Archimedes exemplified the power of applying rigorous mathematical thinking to practical problems while simultaneously advancing abstract theoretical understanding. In astronomy, the library hosted Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system nearly 1800 years before Copernicus. Though his complete works are lost, we know through references by later writers that Aristarchus argued the Earth rotated on its axis and revolved around the Sun, a radical departure from the geocentric view that dominated ancient thought. While his heliocentric theory was not widely accepted, the fact that he could propose such a revolutionary idea, and that it was preserved and transmitted by the library even as a minority view, demonstrates the intellectual openness that characterized Alexandria at its best. Try to imagine Aristarchus at work in an Alexandrian observation space, perhaps a rooftop platform with clear views of the night sky. With simple measuring tools, a gnomon for shadows, a dioptra for measuring angles, he would carefully track celestial movements night after night. During days, he might pore over Babylonian astronomical records preserved in the library, noting patterns and anomalies in centuries of observations. Gradually, these patient observations led to his revolutionary insight that the apparent motions of heavens could be more simply explained by a moving Earth than by an Earth-centered cosmos with complex planetary movements. The medical sciences found their greatest ancient practitioner in Herophilus of Chalcedon, who established Alexandria as the leading center for anatomical research. Unlike many ancient Greek physicians who relied primarily on external symptoms and theoretical systems, Herophilus conducted systematic human dissections, a practice permitted under early Ptolemaic rule. Through these unprecedented investigations, he identified the brain, not the heart, as the seat of intelligence, distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, described the eye's anatomy in detail, and made numerous other discoveries that would not be equaled until the Renaissance. Imagine Herophilus in a specialized room of the Mausion, conducting a dissection before a small group of medical students. With precise tools and methodical care, he would demonstrate structures never before seen by human eyes, naming parts of anatomy still known by his terminology today. His approach represented a fundamental shift in medical understanding, knowledge based on direct observation rather than philosophical speculation, a hallmark of the Alexandrian empirical tradition. In mathematics, Apollonius of Perga produced his masterwork on conic sections while working in Alexandria. His 8-volume treatise analyzed the properties of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas with such thoroughness that little was added to the subject until the 17th century. The terms we still use for these curves come directly from Apollonius, whose work would later prove essential for understanding planetary motion and projectile trajectories. The patient, detailed exploration of mathematical properties demonstrated in his work exemplifies the Alexandrian willingness to pursue specialized knowledge to remarkable depths. Literary scholarship reached unprecedented sophistication under figures like Zenodotus of Ephesus and Aristarchus of Samothrace, successive heads of the library who established critical methods for analyzing texts that remain fundamental to modern philology. They compared different versions of works, assessed the authenticity of passages, standardized spelling and punctuation, and developed systems of critical symbols to indicate textual issues, essentially inventing the discipline of textual criticism. The editions of Homer they produced, though now lost, established a standard text that influenced all subsequent transmission of the epics. Picture Aristarchus at a large reading table, surrounded by different versions of the Iliad collected from cities across the Greek world. With methodical care, he would compare each line, noting variations, evaluating which reading best reflected Homer's authentic language, and marking problematic passages with specialized critical symbols. This painstaking work, comparing, evaluating, annotating, created the foundation for all subsequent textual scholarship. Engineering and mechanics flourished under figures like Ctesibius, whose experiments with compressed air and water pressure led to the invention of the pipe organ, improved water clocks, and various automated devices. His successor, Hero or Heron, developed even more elaborate mechanisms, including a primitive steam engine, coin-operated holy water dispensers, and automatic doors for temples. These practical innovations emerged from theoretical understanding of pneumatics and hydraulics, demonstrating how Alexandria fostered connections between abstract knowledge and practical application. Imagine Hero demonstrating one of his ingenious devices in a courtyard of the Mausion, perhaps a small temple model whose doors open automatically when a small fire is lit on a miniature altar. As amazed observers watch, he would explain the scientific principles at work. The fire heats air in a closed container, causing it to expand. This pressure forces water into a counterweight system that pulls open the doors. This blend of theatrical wonder and scientific explanation typified the Alexandrian approach to mechanical knowledge. Later in the library's history, during the Roman period, the mathematician and astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, no relation to the royal dynasty, produced works of extraordinary influence. His Almagest presented a comprehensive geocentric model of the universe that, despite being eventually superseded, represented the most sophisticated mathematical astronomy of its time. His geography compiled what was known of world geography, using a coordinate system remarkably similar to modern latitude and longitude. Both works remained authoritative references for over 1,000 years. Among the last great figures associated with the library was Hypatia, a mathematician, astronomer, and Neoplatonic philosopher who taught in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE. As one of the few women known to have held a prominent intellectual position in the ancient world, Hypatia represents both the continuing vitality of Alexandrian scholarship into late antiquity and its increasingly precarious position in a changing social and religious environment. Her brutal murder by a Christian mob in 45 CE has often been symbolically linked with the final decline of the classical intellectual tradition that the library represented. Imagine Hypatia moving through Alexandria's streets in her philosopher's cloak, perhaps on her way to lecture on mathematics or astronomy. Students from diverse backgrounds, pagans, Christians, Jews, would gather to hear her explicate difficult concepts with remarkable clarity. Her teaching embodied the increasingly rare Alexandrian ideal of knowledge transcending political, religious, and cultural boundaries, an ideal that was becoming more difficult to maintain as the ancient world transformed. Beyond these most famous names were countless others whose contributions, though less celebrated today, were essential to the library's intellectual ecosystem. Catalogers who organized knowledge according to innovative classification schemes, scribes who preserved texts through meticulous copying, translators who made works from many cultures accessible in Greek, commentators who explained difficult passages in ancient works, observational astronomers who maintained night after night of careful stellar records. What united these diverse scholars was a shared approach to knowledge, one that valued empirical observation, logical reasoning, systematic organization, and open debate. While they worked within the intellectual frameworks of their time and were certainly not immune to error or prejudice, they established methods and standards that formed the foundation for much of subsequent Western scientific and humanistic thought. Their achievements were made possible by the unique combination of resources that Alexandria provided: unparalleled access to texts, sustained financial support, freedom to pursue research wherever it led, and a community of fellow scholars with whom to share and refine ideas. As sleep begins to draw closer, let your mind drift among these brilliant figures moving through the halls and gardens of the Malsion Euclid, demonstrating a geometric proof, Eratosthenes calculating the Earth's size, Herophilus revealing the body's inner structures, Aristarchus contemplating a sun-centered cosmos. Their patient, methodical work conducted day after day, year after year, generation after generation, gradually expanded the sphere of human knowledge, creating intellectual treasures as valuable as any gold or jewels in the Ptolemies' coffers. And as we transition to considering the specific intellectual achievements that emerged from this remarkable community, remember that behind each discovery and insight were real human beings, curious, fallible, persistent, and passionate in their pursuit of understanding. Their legacy lives not just in specific discoveries, but in establishing approaches to knowledge that remain vital today, nearly 2 millennia after the library itself was lost. As your consciousness begins to drift more deeply toward sleep, let us contemplate the remarkable intellectual achievements that emerged from the Great Library and Malsion of Alexandria, achievements that continue to influence our world today in ways both obvious and subtle. These were not merely academic exercises, but profound advances in human understanding that changed how we perceive ourselves and our universe. The scholars of Alexandria worked within an intellectual environment unlike any that had existed before, one where the collected wisdom of multiple civilizations was available for comparison and synthesis, where sustained research could be conducted over decades or even lifetimes, and where specialized knowledge could develop through constant refinement and critical examination. From this unique crucible emerged discoveries and innovations across virtually every field of ancient inquiry. In mathematics, the Alexandrian achievement began with Euclid's Elements, composed around 300 BCE. This 13-book masterpiece gathered and systematized earlier Greek mathematical knowledge, presenting it as a unified edifice built from a few simple axioms through rigorous logical proof. Starting from 5 postulates, statements accepted as true without proof, Euclid constructed the entire system of plane geometry, the properties of numbers, and the foundations of solid geometry through pure logical deduction. The elegance and thoroughness of this approach was revolutionary. For the first time, mathematics was presented not as a collection of useful techniques or interesting observations, but as a complete, internally consistent system derived from first principles. The Elements established a standard for mathematical rigor that remains influential today and introduced a method of logical demonstration that would influence fields far beyond mathematics. Imagine for a moment the intellectual satisfaction of following one of Euclid's proofs, the way each step follows inevitably from what came before, the elegant simplicity of the reasoning, the sense of absolute certainty in the conclusion. This was a new kind of knowledge, not based on authority or tradition, but demonstrated through reason accessible to anyone with the patience to follow the argument. When Benjamin Franklin later wrote that the Declaration of Independence had been drafted with the same certainty as those of Euclid, he was acknowledging the Elements as the ultimate standard for irrefutable reasoning. Building on Euclid's foundations, later Alexandrian mathematicians explored ever more sophisticated territory. Apollonius of Perga produced his comprehensive work on conic sections, the curves formed when a plane intersects a cone. His analysis of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas was so thorough that little was added to the subject until the 17th century, when Johannes Kepler discovered that planets move in elliptical orbits around the Sun. The mathematics developed in ancient Alexandria thus became, centuries later, essential for understanding the structure of our solar system. In astronomy, Alexandrian achievements were equally remarkable. Timocharis and Aristillus created the first comprehensive star catalogue in the Western tradition, carefully recording the positions of hundreds of stars. This catalogue, later expanded by Hipparchus and eventually Ptolemy, established the foundation for tracking celestial movements over time and identifying changes in the heavens. Aristarchus of Samos made the revolutionary proposal that the Earth rotates on its axis and revolves around the Sun, anticipating Copernicus by nearly 1800 years. Although his heliocentric model was not widely accepted, the very fact that he could propose such a radical reconception of cosmic structure and that his work was preserved by the library despite representing a minority view, demonstrates the intellectual openness that characterized Alexandria at its best. The most comprehensive astronomical achievement of the Alexandrian tradition came with Claudius Ptolemy's Almagest in the 2nd century CE. Though still working within a geocentric framework, Ptolemy created a mathematical model of planetary motion of remarkable accuracy and sophistication. Using combinations of circles, difference, and epicycles moving at different rates, he created a system that could predict planetary positions with precision adequate for the observational tools of his time. This model remained the standard understanding of the cosmos for over 1,000 years, a testament to both its practical utility and the intellectual authority of the Alexandrian tradition. Perhaps the most precisely measured achievement came from Eratosthenes and his calculation of Earth's circumference. Recognizing that the different angles of shadows at Alexandria and Siene, modern Aswan, at the same moment could only be explained by the curvature of a spherical Earth, he used the angular difference and the known distance between the cities to calculate the planet's size. His figure of approximately 252,000 stadia translates to about 39,690 kilometers, 24,062 miles, remarkably close to the modern measurement of 40,075 kilometers, 24,901 miles around the equator. Consider the intellectual elegance of this method. A conclusion about the entire planet derived from the length of shadows and a measured distance. No spacecraft, no satellite imagery, no modern technology, just careful observation, geometric understanding, and logical reasoning. This exemplifies the power of the Alexandrian approach to knowledge, finding ingenious ways to measure what seems immeasurable, to know what seems unknowable. In geography, the library's scholars extended this same methodical approach to mapping the world. Eratosthenes created a world map based on all available information, introducing a system of latitude lines and attempting to place major geographical features in their correct relative positions. Though limited by the exploratory reach of his time, his approach established principles of cartography that would develop over subsequent centuries. Later, Claudius Ptolemy's geography expanded this work, introducing a coordinate system remarkably similar to modern latitude and longitude, and compiling location data for thousands of places across the known world. The medical sciences perhaps best exemplify the Alexandrian commitment to empirical knowledge. Unlike many ancient medical traditions that relied primarily on theory and external symptoms, Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted systematic human dissections to understand internal anatomy. This practice, permitted under early Ptolemaic rule, but rare or prohibited elsewhere in the ancient world, allowed unprecedented insights into human physiology. Herophilus identified the brain as the center of the nervous system and seat of intelligence, challenging the common view that the heart was the center of thought. He distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, described the eye's structure in remarkable detail, and made observations about the human pulse so precise that they were not improved upon for centuries. His contemporary Erasistratus came remarkably close to discovering blood circulation, describing the heart's valves and their function, though the complete understanding of circulatory system would wait until William Harvey's work in the 17th century. Their approach represented a fundamental shift in medical understanding, knowledge based on direct observation rather than philosophical speculation. While the ethical complexities of their anatomical research, which allegedly included vivisection of condemned criminals, cannot be ignored, the methodological principle they established, that medical knowledge should be grounded in empirical examination rather than theory alone, remains a cornerstone of modern medicine. In mechanics and engineering, Alexandria produced innovations that sometimes seem almost modern in their ingenuity. Ctesibius experimented with compressed air and hydraulics, developing more accurate water clocks, the hydraulic pipe organ, hydraulis, and various automated devices. His successor Hero or Heron created an even more remarkable array of mechanical wonders, including the eolipile, a primitive steam engine that converted thermal energy to rotary motion, automatic temple doors, a coin-operated holy water dispenser, and self-moving theatrical devices powered by falling weights. While these devices might seem like mere curiosities, they represented sophisticated understanding of pneumatics, hydraulics, and mechanical principles. Hero's work on pneumatics systematically analyzed the behavior of air and water under different conditions, establishing principles that would not be significantly advanced until the scientific revolution. The Alexandrian approach to mechanics, combining theoretical understanding with practical implementation, established a model for technological development that continues in modern engineering. The field of optics saw significant advances through the work of scholars like Euclid and Ptolemy. Euclid's optics explored the geometry of vision, analyzing how light travels in straight lines and how the apparent size of objects relates to visual angles. Ptolemy conducted experimental studies of reflection and refraction, measuring how light bends when passing between media of different densities. Though his quantitative results for refraction were not entirely accurate, his methodical experimental approach, setting up controlled conditions, making careful measurements, seeking mathematical relationships, exemplifies the empirical spirit of Alexandrian science. In the realm of geography and exploration, the library served as both repository and catalyst. Accounts of voyages and explorations from across the known world were gathered in Alexandria, allowing scholars to compile comprehensive geographic knowledge. The Ptolemies sponsored exploratory expeditions, particularly southward along the Red Sea coast and into the interior of Africa, adding new first-hand information to this knowledge base. Eratosthenes synthesized these diverse sources into a systematic geography, introducing concepts like climate zones based on the sun's angle and attempting to calculate distances between major points on the Earth's surface. The linguistic and literary achievements of the library were equally significant. Alexandria's scholars essentially invented systematic textual criticism, the discipline of establishing accurate versions of important texts by comparing multiple copies, evaluating variants, and applying consistent editorial principles. Xenodotus of Ephesus, the library's first official head, produced the first critical edition of Homer, introducing a system of critical marks to indicate doubtful passages. His successor, Aristarchus of Samothrace, refined these methods, producing Homer editions that became the standard texts transmitted to later generations. This philological work extended far beyond Homer to encompass the entire corpus of Greek literature. Scholars compiled comprehensive lists of authors and their works, established chronologies, settled questions of authentic and spurious attributions, and created the foundational tools of literary scholarship. The library's approach to organizing this vast body of material, Callimachus's Pinarchus's, with its systematic categorization by genre and author, establish principles of bibliographic control that remain relevant in modern library science. Alexandria became a center for lexicography as well, with scholars compiling dictionaries of rare or obsolete words, specialized technical terminology, and dialectal variations. These works preserved understanding of terms that might otherwise have become completely obscure as language naturally evolved. The tradition of systematic lexicography established in Alexandria continues in our modern dictionaries and specialized glossaries. Perhaps less tangible but equally important were the philosophical developments fostered by the library's environment. The access to diverse intellectual traditions, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Babylonian, and others, encouraged comparative approaches and syncretic thinking. While Athens remained the center of the major philosophical schools, Platonic Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, Epicurean Garden, and Stoic Porch, Alexandria offered a different kind of philosophical space, one where these traditions could be studied side by side, their texts carefully preserved and compared. This environment particularly influenced the development of Neoplatonism in later centuries, a philosophical movement that synthesized elements from Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoreanism, and various religious traditions into new systems of thought. Figures like Philo of Alexandria, who blended Jewish scripture with Greek philosophical concepts, and later Hypatia and her father Theon, exemplified this synthetic approach. The Alexandrian philosophical tradition valued textual scholarship and mathematical precision, alongside more speculative metaphysics, creating a distinctive intellectual culture. The library's greatest achievement may have been methodological rather than confined to any specific discovery. Alexandria established an approach to knowledge characterized by several key elements: systematic collection and organization of existing information, critical evaluation of sources, empirical observation where possible, mathematical precision in measurement and calculation. This methodical approach, while not consistently applied across all fields or by all scholars, represented a significant advance in how humans pursued knowledge. It established standards and practices that would be rediscovered and expanded during the scientific revolution nearly 2 millennia later. When Renaissance scholars sought to move beyond medieval approaches to knowledge, they often looked back to Alexandrian models as guides for this intellectual rebirth. As sleep draws nearer and your thoughts grow more dreamlike, consider how these ancient achievements continue to touch our lives today. The geometry taught in modern schools remains essentially Euclidean. Astronomical terminology still uses concepts developed in Alexandria. Medical students still learn anatomical structures first identified by Herophilus. Library classification systems still reflect principles established by Callimachus. The very idea of a research university, a community of scholars pursuing knowledge across diverse fields with institutional support, has its clearest ancient precedent in the Alexandrian Mouseion. The intellectual legacy of Alexandria reminds us that the human capacity for rational inquiry, empirical observation, and systematic knowledge building has deep historical roots. As we drift toward dreams, we might take comfort in this continuity. The connection between ancient scholars working by lamplight over papyrus scrolls and modern researchers at their computers, separated by time and technology, but united in the fundamental quest to understand our world and ourselves. And as we transition to considering how this knowledge was preserved and transmitted through time, remember that each intellectual achievement we've explored required not just brilliant original insights, but also the careful work of preservation, the copying of texts, the teaching of students, the continuous renewal of knowledge that allowed these ancient discoveries to survive the library's own eventual destruction. As night deepens around you and thoughts become more fluid, let us explore the patient. Often invisible work that allowed Alexandria's intellectual treasures to survive across centuries. The meticulous processes of preservation and translation that ensured ancient wisdom would not be lost to time. For all its brilliant discoveries and innovations, perhaps the library's most enduring achievement was the development of systematic approaches to maintaining and transmitting knowledge across generations and between cultures. The fundamental challenge faced by the Alexandrian librarians was the inherently fragile nature of their primary medium, papyrus. Made from the pith of the Cyperus papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, papyrus provided an excellent writing surface that was relatively lightweight and flexible. Yet it was vulnerable to numerous threats. Moisture could cause the fibers to swell and distort, excessive dryness made it brittle. Insects found the organic material appetizing, mold could develop in humid conditions, and the simple act of rolling and unrolling scrolls gradually weakened the material over time. Imagine the daily care required to maintain hundreds of thousands of such scrolls in the Mediterranean climate of Egypt. Library attendants would need to regularly inspect the collection for signs of damage or deterioration. Scrolls would be carefully unrolled to check for problems, then properly re-rolled to prevent creasing. The storage niches, or pigeonholes, would require regular cleaning to prevent dust accumulation or insect infestation. The entire facility would need careful management of light exposure, as direct sunlight would fade ink and damage papyrus fibers. The Alexandrians developed various preservation techniques to extend the life of their precious texts. Cedar oil was commonly applied to papyrus scrolls as an insect repellent, though this treatment could eventually discolor the material. Storage containers. Cylindrical cases made of wood or leather-protected scrolls when not in use. Climate control, to the extent possible in the ancient world, was likely attempted through the architectural design of storage areas, perhaps utilizing subterranean chambers where temperature and humidity remained more stable. Despite these efforts, the inevitable deterioration of materials meant that texts required regular recopying to ensure their survival. This process, laborious, time-consuming, and expensive, formed the backbone of the library's preservation efforts. In dedicated spaces, trained scribes would work carefully to create fresh copies of aging texts. Imagine the patient concentration required. A scribe sitting at a comfortable height, the original scroll gradually unrolled to expose each column of text, a fresh papyrus sheet prepared with ruled lines, a reed pen carefully dipped in ink made from soot mixed with gum arabic, each character meticulously reproduced with attention to accuracy. This was not mere mechanical reproduction. The scribe needed to understand the text well enough to recognize words and phrases, to correctly divide words when ancient texts often ran characters together without spaces, to appropriately preserve or modernize spelling conventions, and to make judgments about unclear portions of damaged originals. For specialized technical works, mathematical treatises, astronomical tables, medical texts with anatomical terminology, the copyist required sufficient subject knowledge to accurately transmit the content. The Alexandrian approach to this copying process was more systematic than previous traditions. Senior scholars would compare different copies of important works, attempting to establish the most accurate version before creating new official copies. Textual variants would be noted and evaluated. In the case of literary works like Homer's epics, the librarians developed a sophisticated system of critical marks, oboloi and asteriskoi, to indicate passages of doubtful authenticity or noteworthy features. This systematic textual criticism, evaluating the relative authority of different versions and attempting to establish authentic readings, was perhaps Alexandria's most significant contribution to the preservation of textual knowledge. Beyond simply maintaining texts in their original Greek, The library pioneered systematic translation between languages. Under Ptolemaic patronage, scholars undertook the monumental project of translating Hebrew scriptures into Greek, creating what became known as the Septuagint, named for the legendary 72 translators who supposedly completed the work in 72 days. This translation made Jewish religious texts accessible to Greek-speaking readers throughout the Mediterranean world and became enormously influential in the development of early Christianity. The translation process extended to other languages as well. Works from Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and possibly even Indian traditions were rendered into Greek. This required not just linguistic expertise but cultural knowledge, understanding context, specialized terminology, and concepts that might not have direct equivalents in Greek. Some ancient scientific and mathematical works from Babylon and Egypt had to be not just linguistically translated, but conceptually transformed, as different cultures used different numerical systems, units of measurement, and conceptual frameworks. Picture a translation team at work in the library, perhaps an Egyptian priest with deep knowledge of traditional texts collaborating with a Greek scholar, fluent in both languages, carefully working through a hieroglyphic religious text to create a version comprehensible to Greek readers. They would face not just word-by-word translation challenges, but deeper questions of cultural meaning, religious significance, and conceptual equivalence. This cross-cultural intellectual work represented a form of preservation that transcended simple textual copying, preserving ideas and knowledge across linguistic boundaries. As texts were copied and translated, they required organization and cataloging to remain accessible. The Ptolemaics created by Callimachus represented the most ambitious bibliographic project of the ancient world, an attempt to systematically catalog the entire collection by subject and author. This 120-scroll work included biographical information about authors, authentication of disputed works, standardization of titles, and classification into subject categories. By organizing knowledge in this way, the Alexandrians ensured that specific texts could be located within their vast collection and that relationships between works could be identified. The preservation work extended beyond the physical texts to the knowledge they contained. The commentary tradition that flourished in Alexandria involved scholars writing explanatory notes on difficult or obscure works, essentially preserving the understanding of texts along with the texts themselves. These commentaries might explain obsolete words, identify historical references, clarify scientific concepts, or discuss philosophical implications. When modern readers encounter ancient Greek texts with marginal scholia, explanatory notes, they are seeing the distant descendants of this Alexandrian practice. Teaching represented another crucial form of preservation. The knowledge contained in the library's scrolls was transmitted through formal and informal instruction. Senior scholars training younger colleagues, visiting researchers explaining specialized topics, regular lectures and discussions within the Halcyon community. This living transmission of knowledge provided context and understanding that written texts alone could not convey. A medical text describing surgical procedures, for instance, would be far more valuable when explained by an experienced physician who could demonstrate techniques and answer questions. The Alexandrian approach to preservation was not static or purely conservative. As knowledge developed, texts would be updated or supplemented. Astronomical tables would be extended with new observations. Geographical works would incorporate information from recent explorations. Medical texts would be annotated with new treatments or case studies. This dynamic relationship with textual knowledge, preserving the old while incorporating the new, kept the library's collection vital and relevant, rather than becoming merely an archive of antiquities. The Ptolemies' commitment to preservation extended beyond their borders through an extensive copying and distribution network. The library would provide copies of important works to scholars and institutions throughout the Mediterranean world. sometimes as gifts cementing diplomatic relationships, sometimes in exchange for copies of texts Alexandria did not possess, sometimes sold to wealthy collectors or educational institutions. This distribution created redundancy that proved crucial for long-term preservation. When the Alexandrian collection eventually suffered damage and destruction, copies preserved elsewhere allowed many works to survive. As centuries passed and political control of Egypt changed hands, the preservation challenges evolved. The rise of parchment made from treated animal skins as an alternative writing material offered more durability than papyrus, but at greater expense. The codex format bound pages similar to modern books gradually replaced scrolls, requiring decisions about transferring texts from one format to another. New religious and political authorities brought different priorities for what knowledge should be preserved and transmitted. During the Roman period, the library's comprehensive approach to preservation became increasingly difficult to maintain as resources diminished and institutional focus narrowed. Yet the methods and standards established during the Ptolemaic heyday continued to influence how knowledge was preserved throughout the Mediterranean world. Centers of learning in Rome, Athens, Pergamum, Antioch, and elsewhere adopted cataloging systems, textual criticism approaches, and copying standards developed in Alexandria. Perhaps most significantly for the modern world, the Islamic scholarly tradition that emerged in the medieval period embraced and extended these Alexandrian approaches to preservation and translation. As Muslim civilization expanded in the 7th–9th century CE, scholars recognized the value of Greek knowledge in fields like medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. They established translation movements, particularly centered in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, that systematically rendered Greek works into Arabic, often via intermediate Syriac translations. This Arabic preservation phase proved crucial for many Alexandrian texts. Works by Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and Aristotle were carefully translated, commented upon, and incorporated into Islamic scholarly traditions. When these Arabic versions were later translated into Latin during the 12th–13th centuries, they reintroduced much of the Alexandrian intellectual heritage to Western Europe, helping to spark the Renaissance and the later scientific revolution. As your consciousness drifts toward deeper sleep, imagine this chain of transmission spanning centuries and cultures. A Greek mathematical text copied and recopied in Alexandria, translated into Syriac by scholars in 6th century Mesopotamia, rendered into Arabic in 9th century Baghdad, translated into Latin in 12th century Toledo, copied by monks in medieval European monasteries, printed on early presses in Renaissance Italy, and finally reaching a form recognizable in modern textbooks. Each link in this chain represented countless hours of careful, patient work by individuals committed to preserving and transmitting knowledge across time and space. The preservation methods developed in Alexandria, systematic copying, careful cataloguing, textual criticism, commentary, translation between languages, and distribution of copies, created an approach to knowledge maintenance that transcended the physical library itself. Even after the destruction of the original collection, a topic we will explore later, the principles and practices established there continued to influence how subsequent civilizations valued and protected written knowledge. As we transition to considering the library's broader influence on the ancient world, reflect on how this meticulous preservation work, often anonymous, usually unglamorous, made possible the continued influence of Alexandrian achievements long after the institution itself had disappeared. The scholars who carefully copied texts, translated between languages, and organized knowledge systems could not have known how their efforts would echo through millennia. Yet their patient work formed the essential bridge between ancient insights and our modern understanding. As sleep draws ever nearer, let us explore how the intellectual beacon of Alexandria cast its light across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, transforming how people thought about knowledge and its pursuit. The library and Malsion did not exist in isolation, but formed the vibrant center of a vast network of scholarship and cultural exchange that influenced civilizations from Rome to Persia, from North Africa to the Indian border. Alexandria's influence began with its magnetic pull on scholars and students from across the known world. The unprecedented concentration of resources, texts from countless traditions, financial support from the wealthy Ptolemaic treasury, and a community of brilliant minds drew ambitious intellectuals like moths to flame. A promising young mathematician in Athens, a physician from Asia Minor, an astronomer from Rhodes, a poet from Syracuse, all might dream of studying or working in Alexandria, where they could access materials and colleagues unavailable anywhere else. Imagine the journeys these knowledge seekers undertook, travelling across the Mediterranean by ship or along dusty roads by land, drawn by Alexandria's reputation. Some came for brief visits to consult specific texts or meet particular scholars. Others remained for years or even lifetimes. Upon returning to their home cities, they carried not just specific knowledge, but Alexandrian methods and standards, spreading these approaches throughout the ancient intellectual world. The library established what we might now call academic standards that gradually influenced scholarly work everywhere. The Alexandrian emphasis on textual criticism, carefully comparing different versions of important works to establish authoritative texts, became the expected approach for serious literary scholarship. Their cataloguing systems influenced how other collections were organized. Their commitment to empirical observation in fields like astronomy and medicine challenged more speculative approaches. Even the basic expectation that knowledge should be systematically organized and made accessible rather than hoarded or kept secret represented a significant shift in intellectual culture. This influence operated through various channels. The most direct was the training of scholars who studied in Alexandria before returning to their home regions or travelling to other centres of learning. These individuals, whether they spent months or decades in the city, absorbed Alexandrian methods and carried them elsewhere. A physician trained in Alexandria's medical tradition might establish a practice in Athens or Antioch, teaching students according to the empirical approaches he had learned. An astronomer might set up an observation program in Rhodes following Alexandrian methodological standards. A textual scholar might apply Alexandrian critical techniques to local literary traditions in Pergamon or Syracuse. Another channel of influence was the distribution of texts. The library regularly produced copies of important works that were sent throughout the Mediterranean world, sometimes as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, sometimes through commercial transactions with other institutions, sometimes carried by scholars returning to their homes. These copies not only spread specific content, but also demonstrated Alexandrian standards of textual organization, scholarly annotation, and physical production. The clear column layout, careful pagination, scholarly commentaries in margins or separate companion texts, all these features would influence how texts were produced and used elsewhere. Correspondence networks formed another crucial medium of influence. Scholars in Alexandria maintained regular written communication with colleagues across the Mediterranean and Near East, exchanging ideas, posing questions, sharing new discoveries, and requesting information. These letters, carried by merchants, diplomatic couriers, or dedicated messengers, created intellectual communities that transcended geography. A mathematical problem being discussed in Alexandria might simultaneously be considered in Athens, Rhodes, and Syracuse, with proposed solutions travelling back and forth across the sea, creating a distributed problem-solving network remarkable for an age of slow communication. The Ptolemaic rulers understood the diplomatic value of Alexandria's intellectual prestige and deliberately cultivated scholarly connections as part of their foreign policy. Royal letters would be sent to other Hellenistic kingdoms and independent cities, offering copies of rare texts, inviting scholars to visit Alexandria, or proposing collaborative projects. These intellectual exchanges often paralleled and reinforced political and commercial relationships, creating multi-layered connections between states. The soft power of cultural prestige amplified Egypt's influence beyond what military or economic strength alone could achieve. Alexandria's cosmopolitan approach to knowledge collecting and preserving wisdom from diverse cultures rather than privileging only Greek traditions gradually influenced the broader Hellenistic intellectual world. While Greek chauvinism certainly persisted, Alexandria demonstrated the value of engaging with Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, and other knowledge systems. This openness to cross-cultural learning was partially adopted by other centers, particularly as the practical benefits became apparent in fields like astronomy, where Babylonian observational records proved invaluable, and medicine, where Egyptian practical techniques complemented Greek theoretical approaches. Specific fields of knowledge show clear Alexandrian fingerprints across the ancient world. In mathematics, Euclid's Elements became the standard textbook throughout the Mediterranean, establishing both specific content and a general approach to mathematical reasoning based on axioms and logical proof. His influence extended far beyond geometry to shape how rigorous thinking was understood across disciplines. When mathematicians in other cities built upon Euclidean foundations, as Archimedes did in Syracuse or Apollonius in Perga and later Alexandria, they were extending an intellectual tradition that had been systematized and disseminated from the library. In astronomy, the observational and computational methods developed in Alexandria transformed how the heavens were studied throughout the Greek-speaking world and beyond. The careful measurement of celestial positions, the mathematical modeling of planetary motions, the calculation of eclipse cycles, approaches refined in Alexandria became standard practice wherever serious astronomical work was conducted. The technical terminology and conceptual frameworks established there shaped astronomical discourse for centuries, extending eventually into Arabic, Latin, and Sanskrit astronomical traditions. Medical practice shows perhaps the most direct Alexandrian influence on daily life throughout the ancient Mediterranean. The anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus, their emphasis on empirical observation rather than pure theory, and their systematic documentation of diseases and treatments gradually transformed how medicine was practiced in major cities. Physicians trained in Alexandria or influenced by Alexandrian texts would bring more anatomically informed approaches to surgery, more systematic diagnostic methods, and more careful documentation of cases. While traditional and folk medicine certainly persisted, the standard for educated medical practice increasingly reflected Alexandrian influences. Engineering and technology developed in Alexandria spread through both texts and trained practitioners. The mechanical principles explored by figures like Ctesibius and Hero were documented in treatises that circulated widely among the technically inclined. Devices first developed in Alexandria, improved water clocks, hydraulic systems, pneumatic mechanisms, were reproduced in other cities, often by engineers who had studied Alexandrian methods. When a wealthy Roman wanted an impressive automated display for his garden, or a temple needed a sophisticated water management system, they might well seek out someone trained in the Alexandrian mechanical tradition. Even in areas where Alexandria was not preeminent, its influence shaped how disciplines developed. Poetry and literature continued to flourish in many centers, but the Alexandrian emphasis on erudition, allusion to earlier works, and technical perfection, exemplified by poets like Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes, who were associated with the library, influenced literary production throughout the Hellenistic world. The scholarly apparatus developed for studying Homer, was gradually applied to other literary traditions, creating more systematic approaches to textual analysis. The influence extended to institutions as well as ideas and methods. Other Hellenistic rulers, seeing the prestige and practical benefits of the Mouseion and library, established their own cultural institutions. Most famously, the kings of Pergamon in Asia Minor created a significant library that eventually rivaled Alexandria in some respects, leading to competition for texts and scholars. This institutional competition, which according to some accounts became intense enough that the Ptolemies banned papyrus exports to Pergamon, forcing the development of parchment as an alternative writing material, demonstrates how thoroughly the Alexandrian model had established the library as a symbol of cultural achievement and royal legitimacy. Less grandiose, but perhaps more numerously, smaller libraries and schools throughout the Mediterranean incorporated elements of the Alexandrian approach. A wealthy Greek city might establish a gymnasium library organized according to Alexandrian classification principles. A philosophical school in Athens might adopt Alexandrian text criticism methods for studying foundational works. A medical school in Kos might organize its teaching around texts and approaches developed in Alexandria. These institutions would naturally adapt Alexandrian models to their own needs and resources, but the influence remained visible in their basic organization and methods. As Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean world in the late Hellenistic period, educated Romans increasingly looked to Alexandria as a cultural and intellectual model. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to study there. Roman generals and politicians visited the city and its famous library. Some even attempted to acquire portions of the Alexandrian collection for their own libraries in Italy. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony both spent significant time in Alexandria and fell under the influence of its cultural sophistication, and in Antony's case, the charismatic Ptolemaic queen Cleopatra VII. This Roman fascination with Alexandrian learning ensured that its influence would continue even as political power shifted westward. The spread of Alexandrian knowledge and methods faced significant challenges, of course. Travel and communication remained slow and sometimes dangerous in the ancient world. Languages presented barriers, while Greek served as a lingua franca among educated elites across the eastern Mediterranean. Literacy in Greek was limited elsewhere. Political conflicts occasionally disrupted scholarly networks. The expense of book copying restricted the circulation of many texts to wealthy institutions or individuals. Yet despite these obstacles, Alexandria's intellectual influence expanded steadily throughout the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Alexandria's influence was the establishment of a new relationship between political power and intellectual activity. The Ptolemies demonstrated that supporting scholarship through collection and preservation of texts, funding for researchers, and creation of institutional structures for knowledge production brought prestige and practical benefits to a state. This model of royal or state patronage for intellectual work, while not entirely new, reached unprecedented scale in Alexandria and created a template that would be followed by ambitious rulers for centuries to come. As your consciousness drifts toward deeper sleep, imagine this network of influence spreading outward from Alexandria, like ripples across water scholars, journeying to distant cities, carrying Alexandrian methods in their minds and texts in their luggage. Letters discussing astronomical observations or mathematical problems crossing the Mediterranean by ship. Engineers applying principles developed in Alexandria to build water systems in Asia Minor or Sicily. Physicians trained in Alexandrian anatomy, treating patients in Athens or Antioch. Copies of Euclid's Elements being studied by students in Rome. This network formed a kind of distributed intelligence, a community of minds separated by distance but united by shared methods, texts, and problems. When Alexandria itself eventually faced challenges and decline, This distributed nature of its influence would prove crucial for the preservation of its intellectual legacy. The knowledge that had once been concentrated in a single remarkable institution had been sufficiently dispersed that it could survive in scattered form, preserved in other libraries, in private collections, in the teaching traditions of schools far from Egypt, and in the practical applications of Alexandrian discoveries in fields from medicine to engineering. As we transition to considering the challenges and setbacks that the library faced over its long history, remember that its greatest achievement may have been this dispersal of knowledge and methods, creating an intellectual diaspora that ensured its contributions would endure even when the physical institution faced destruction. The light kindled in Alexandria would continue to illuminate the ancient world even when the original beacon had dimmed or been extinguished. As night deepens around you and your thoughts begin to slow, let us turn to the more somber chapters in the library's story, the various challenges, setbacks, and smaller fires that tested the institution long before its final destruction. For the Great Library of Alexandria did not decline suddenly from a single catastrophic event, as is sometimes imagined, but faced a series of challenges over centuries, adapting and persisting through difficult periods before its eventual end. The library's earliest challenges were institutional rather than physical. Even during the reigns of the first Ptolemies, the golden age of Alexandrian scholarship, there were tensions inherent in the structure and mission of the institution. The library existed at the intersection of pure intellectual pursuit and royal politics, creating inevitable strains. Scholars valued open inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge wherever it might lead. The Ptolemaic rulers, while genuinely interested in cultural achievement, also saw the library as a political tool for enhancing their prestige and legitimacy. These tensions occasionally flared into outright conflict. When Ptolemy III appointed Eratosthenes as head librarian around 245 BCE, he passed over Apollonius of Rhodes, who had been the expected successor based on scholarly merit. This royal intervention in the library's leadership reportedly prompted Apollonius to leave Alexandria for Rhodes in protest, an early example of how political considerations could disrupt the intellectual community. Similar episodes likely occurred throughout the Ptolemaic period, usually leaving less prominent traces in the historical record. Changes in royal personality and priorities could significantly impact the library's resources and standing. The early Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, were exceptional in their commitment to intellectual patronage. Later rulers in the dynasty, facing increasing political and economic challenges, sometimes showed less interest in supporting scholarship at the same lavish level. Funding might be reduced during periods of war or economic difficulty. Appointments might be made for political rather than intellectual reasons. Royal attention might shift to other priorities like military campaigns or palace intrigues. By the late Ptolemaic period, the kingdom itself was in decline, increasingly dominated by Roman influence and torn by internal dynastic conflicts. These political troubles inevitably affected the library and Mausion. Reduced funding would limit new acquisitions and the support available for scholars. Political instability might discourage international scholars from coming to Alexandria. The intellectual environment would become more constrained as rulers grew less tolerant of potentially subversive ideas during periods of insecurity. One particularly damaging episode occurred during the reign of Ptolemy VIII Physcon, ruled 145 to 116 BCE with interruptions. According to some ancient sources, he conducted a purge of intellectuals associated with his predecessors, driving many scholars out of Alexandria. While the account may be exaggerated by his political opponents, it suggests a period when the intellectual community faced direct political persecution rather than royal support. Even if the library itself remained intact, the loss of human capital experienced scholars forced to flee, would have damaged the intellectual ecosystem that had made Alexandria exceptional. Beyond these institutional challenges, Alexandria experienced periodic civil unrest that sometimes directly threatened the library complex. The city's diverse population, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others, coexisted relatively peacefully during prosperous times, but tensions could erupt during periods of economic hardship or political instability. The late Ptolemaic period saw increasing conflict between ethnic communities, sometimes spilling into violent riots. While we have limited specific evidence of damage to the library during these disturbances, any institution located in the royal quarter would be vulnerable during periods of civil conflict. The first documented physical threat to the library came during Julius Caesar's Alexandrian campaign of 48–47 BCE. Caesar, pursuing his rival Pompey, had followed him to Egypt, arriving shortly after Pompey's murder by agents of the young Ptolemy XIII. Finding himself in a volatile political situation, caught between the rival claims of Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII Caesar, occupied the royal quarter of Alexandria with a small force, and soon found himself besieged by much larger Egyptian forces. During this conflict, Caesar ordered ships in the harbour to be set on fire to prevent their use by his enemies. According to several ancient accounts, this fire spread to buildings on the shore, destroying what is described as 40,000 scrolls. There has been considerable scholarly debate about exactly what was destroyed in this fire. It seems unlikely to have been the main library collection, which was located inland in the royal quarter that Caesar himself was occupying. More probably, it affected a storage depot or subsidiary collection near the harbour. Nevertheless, this incident represents the first known significant loss of texts from the Alexandrian collections. Even if the main library remained intact, the destruction of tens of thousands of scrolls would have been a serious blow. Some of these might have been duplicate copies, but others would have been unique texts awaiting processing into the main collection or works set aside for copying or trading with other institutions. The Caesarean fire, while damaging, did not end the library's existence. Ancient accounts make clear that Alexandria remained an intellectual centre for centuries afterward, which would have been impossible if its entire collection had been destroyed at this point. Indeed, Mark Antony is said to have given Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon some years later, reportedly to replace losses from the fire. A gift that would make little sense if the main library no longer existed. After Egypt became a Roman province following the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE, the library and Mausion entered a new phase. No longer the project of an independent Hellenistic kingdom with unlimited resources, they now operated within the constraints of Roman provincial administration. The early Roman emperors, particularly Augustus and his successors, continued to provide some support for these institutions, recognizing their cultural importance and prestige value. However, the level of funding and political priority inevitably declined compared to the heyday of Ptolemaic patronage. This transition brought both challenges and adaptations. The Mausion appears to have become more focused on teaching and less on pure research than during its early period. The acquisition policy for the library likely became more selective as resources diminished. Yet scholarship continued. Figures like the astronomer and geographer Claudius Ptolemy, active in the 2nd century CE, demonstrate that Alexandria remained capable of producing work of the highest quality well into the Roman period. During the general crisis of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century CE, Alexandria experienced several episodes of violence and destruction that likely affected the library. The Emperor Caracalla ordered a massacre of Alexandrian young men in 25 CE, which would have disrupted the intellectual community even if the library itself was not directly targeted. More significantly, When the Emperor Aurelian recaptured the city from Zenobia's Palmyrene forces in 273 CE, serious fighting took place in the royal quarter, where the library was located. While we lack specific accounts of damage to the collection during this conflict, it seems unlikely that the library escaped completely unscathed from urban warfare in its immediate vicinity. The most significant challenge before the final destruction may have come from changing intellectual and religious currents rather than physical threats. As Christianity grew from a persecuted minority sect to an increasingly dominant force within the Roman Empire during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, attitudes toward traditional learning underwent a profound shift. The comprehensive, secular approach to knowledge that characterized the Alexandrian tradition, preserving and studying texts from all traditions based on their intellectual merit rather than religious orthodoxy, came under increasing pressure from more exclusivist religious perspectives. Some Christian thinkers embraced classical learning and sought to integrate it with their faith, but others viewed pagan intellectual traditions with deep suspicion. As Christianity moved from the margins to the center of Roman society, especially after Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century, these tensions intensified. Intellectual freedom narrowed, certain topics became dangerous to investigate, funding priorities shifted toward Christian institutions rather than traditional centers of learning. Alexandria itself became a flashpoint for these tensions. The city developed a significant Christian population, while also remaining a stronghold of traditional philosophical schools, particularly Neoplatonism. These communities increasingly came into conflict, especially when encouraged by ambitious religious or political leaders seeking to consolidate their power. The intellectual openness and cosmopolitan spirit that had characterized Alexandrian scholarship at its height became increasingly difficult to maintain in this polarized environment. Against this backdrop of institutional decline, political instability, and increasing religious tension, the library and its remaining collections faced a precarious existence by the late 4th century CE. The institution that had once represented the pinnacle of human knowledge gathering had been reduced through gradual attrition, occasional destruction, and shifting priorities. Yet even in this diminished state, it remained an important symbol of the classical intellectual tradition, and for some, a troubling reminder of pagan learning that stood in opposition to emerging Christian orthodoxy. As you drift closer towards sleep, imagine the library in this later period, its collections perhaps smaller than in its heyday, some of its rooms repurposed or abandoned, its funding more modest, its scholars fewer in number. Yet still, oil lamps would burn as dedicated individuals studied ancient texts. Copies would still be made to preserve decaying scrolls. Students would still gather to learn from masters in specialized fields. The institution had weathered many challenges over its centuries of existence, adapting and persisting even as the world around it transformed. The commitment to knowledge that had inspired its founding continued to animate those who maintained its traditions, even as new threats gathered on the horizon. This resilience in the face of adversity, the quiet persistence of scholars continuing their work through political turmoil, resource constraints, and shifting cultural winds, represents an often overlooked aspect of the library's legacy. The institution was not merely the product of lavish Ptolemaic patronage during its golden age, but also of countless individuals who valued knowledge enough to preserve and transmit it through far less favorable circumstances. As we prepare to consider the final destruction that would eventually claim what remained of the Great Library, remember that this ending came not to an institution at its height, but to one that had already endured much and been transformed by centuries of both gradual change and sudden setbacks. The light of learning that had blazed so brightly under the early Ptolemies had dimmed, but not been extinguished. A testament to the enduring human commitment to knowledge that the library had helped to cultivate throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. As you drift toward deeper sleep, we must confront the most poignant chapter in the library's story, its final decline and the major destructions that eventually claimed what remained of this remarkable institution. The precise events that ended the Great Library have been debated for centuries, becoming almost as much legend as history. Rather than a single dramatic moment, the evidence suggests a series of damaging episodes spread across decades, combined with gradual institutional decay, that finally extinguished this beacon of ancient learning. By the late 4th century CE, Alexandria had transformed significantly from the cosmopolitan intellectual centre of Ptolemaic times. The Roman Empire itself was changing profoundly, with Christianity increasingly dominant following Emperor Constantine's conversion earlier in the century. In 3080 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Nicene Christianity the state religion of the empire and initiating more aggressive policies against pagan practices and institutions. The shifting religious landscape created mounting tensions in Alexandria, where philosophical traditions rooted in earlier religious and intellectual frameworks continued alongside a growing, increasingly powerful Christian community. In this volatile context, the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the syncretic deity Serapis, became a crucial site of conflict. While distinct from the main library, the Serapeum housed what ancient sources call a daughter library or secondary collection. In 3091 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued a decree against pagan temples, and Theophilus, the Bishop of Alexandria, led a Christian mob against the Serapeum. The temple was destroyed, and contemporary accounts suggest its literary collections were lost as well, though some scholars believe portions may have been removed before the destruction. Imagine the scene as this magnificent structure, with its towering columns, elaborate decorations, and collection of texts, was systematically dismantled. Stone would be repurposed for Christian churches, statues would be defaced or melted down. Scrolls and codices containing centuries of knowledge might be burned, scattered, or in some cases perhaps preserved by individuals who recognized their value despite religious differences. This event, while not destroying the main library, which most evidence suggests had already diminished significantly by this time, represented a powerful symbolic moment in Alexandria's transition away from its classical intellectual traditions. The most famous purported destruction of the library came in 640–642 CE, during the Arab conquest of Egypt under the general Imar ibn al-Az. According to a story first recorded centuries later by Ibn al-Kifti, upon capturing Alexandria, Amasa wrote to the Caliph Omar asking what should be done with the books found there. The Caliph supposedly replied, "If what is written in them agrees with the Book of God, the Quran, they are not required. If it disagrees, they are not desired. Destroy them, therefore." The account claims the books were then distributed to the city's bathhouses and used as fuel for heating bath water, allegedly taking 6 months to burn completely. This dramatic story has captured the imagination for centuries, but most modern historians consider it apocryphal for several reasons. It first appears in sources written more than 500 years after the events it describes. It conflicts with earlier Arabic accounts of the conquest that mention no such destruction. The massive scale described, enough books to heat bathhouses for 6 months, seems implausible for whatever collection might have remained by the 7th century. Perhaps most tellingly, the story closely parallels earlier accounts of book destruction from different contexts, suggesting it may be a literary trope rather than historical reporting. While this famous account is likely legendary, the Arab conquest nevertheless represented a significant transition point for Alexandria's intellectual life. Whatever remained of the library's institutional structure would have been disrupted by the change in political control. Some scholars may have fled, funding priorities certainly shifted, the continuity of teaching and research traditions would have been broken. Even without dramatic burning, the conquest likely marked the effective end of whatever still functioned of the ancient library system. Between these better-known events, other destructive episodes likely occurred. The religious philosopher Hypatia, often described as the last great scholar of Alexandria, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE, symbolizing the increasingly perilous position of classical learning in the city. Civil conflicts, urban riots, and periods of economic hardship throughout the 4th–7th centuries would have taken their toll on Alexandria's intellectual institutions and resources. Natural disasters, particularly earthquakes in the region, may have damaged buildings housing collections. Beyond these specific events, the library faced the even more relentless enemy of gradual institutional decay. As funding declined over centuries, fewer new acquisitions would be made and fewer scholars supported. The careful work of preservation, copying deteriorating texts, maintaining proper storage conditions, repairing damaged scrolls, would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The transmission of specialized knowledge required to read and understand ancient texts might be interrupted as teaching traditions were disrupted. Gradually, quietly, texts would be lost, not through dramatic destruction, but through neglect, deterioration, and the simple passage of time. The physical medium of the texts themselves contributed to this vulnerability. Papyrus scrolls, even under ideal conditions, have a limited lifespan. Without regular recopying, an expensive, labor-intensive processed texts would naturally deteriorate. As priority shifted away from preserving the full spectrum of ancient knowledge, difficult choices would be made about which works merited the resources required for copying. Technical works in obsolete scientific traditions, texts in languages fewer people could read, or writings deemed problematic from emerging religious perspectives might be set aside, their contents eventually lost as the original materials decayed beyond recovery. The changing technology of the book itself played a role in this transition. During the early centuries CE, the codex-bound pages, similar to modern books, gradually replaced the scroll as the dominant form for written works. This transition offered both opportunities and challenges for textual preservation. Codices were more durable and space-efficient than scrolls, but transferring content from the old format to the new required deliberate effort and resources. Works that weren't selected for this transition would eventually be lost as scroll technology became obsolete and the skills needed to work with this format faded. The transition to parchment made from treated animal skins as a writing material similarly had mixed implications. More durable than papyrus, parchment better survived the humid Mediterranean climate, but it was also more expensive, meaning fewer works could be preserved in this medium with the same resources. Economic calculations would inevitably influence which texts made this transition and which did not. As your thoughts grow more dreamlike, consider the poignant human dimension of this decline. Scholars watching their institutional support gradually erode, scribes unable to recopy deteriorating texts quickly enough to preserve them all, teachers finding fewer students interested in certain fields of ancient knowledge, librarians making painful decisions about which portions of collections could be maintained with diminishing resources. The end of the library came not primarily through the dramatic violence of flames, though fire played its part, but through these countless small surrenders to entropy and changing priorities. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, what remained was likely only a shadow of the institution at its height, perhaps scattered collections in various locations throughout the city, maintained by different groups with varying levels of resources and commitment. The magnificent, comprehensive vision of the early Ptolemies, gathering all the world's knowledge in one place, had long since given way to more modest realities. Yet even in decline and eventual destruction, something profound was preserved. The knowledge contained in the library was never completely isolated in Alexandria alone. Throughout its centuries of operation, the institution had served as a hub from which learning radiated outward. Copies of texts had been distributed to other centers. Scholars trained in Alexandria had established traditions elsewhere. The methods and approaches pioneered there had been adopted throughout the Mediterranean world. What was lost in physical form often survived in this distributed intellectual legacy. As we transition toward considering the survival of knowledge beyond the library's physical existence, reflect on the complex emotions evoked by contemplating this loss. There is genuine tragedy in the destruction and disappearance of so much ancient wisdom, works of literature, philosophy, science, and history that we know existed but can no longer read. Perspectives and discoveries that might have accelerated human understanding had they survived. Yet there is also a certain peace in recognizing that despite these losses, much did survive. The core achievements of Alexandrian scholars, Euclid's geometry, Eratosthenes' geographical insights, the textual traditions of Homer in Greek drama, fundamental principles of astronomy and medicine, found paths of transmission that carried them beyond the library's destruction. The light kindled in Alexandria was not extinguished, but dispersed, its illumination continuing through countless smaller flames that would eventually help ignite the Renaissance and the modern scientific tradition. As sleep begins to embrace you more fully, let this dual awareness of profound loss and remarkable preservation settle into your consciousness. The story of the library's end reminds us of the vulnerability of human achievements and the impermanence of even our grandest institutions. Yet it also testifies to the resilience of knowledge when it becomes part of a living tradition, passed from mind to mind and generation to generation, capable of surviving the destruction of any single repository, no matter how magnificent. As your consciousness drifts toward the deeper waters of sleep, let us explore the remarkable afterlife of Alexandria's intellectual treasures. How the knowledge gathered in that single, magnificent institution managed to survive despite the library's physical destruction, flowing through hidden channels across centuries and cultures to eventually reshape the modern world. For though the buildings fell and collections scattered, the light of understanding kindled in Alexandria was never fully extinguished. The survival of Alexandrian knowledge depended on multiple transmission paths, each preserving different portions of the vast original collection. Like a great river dividing into many smaller streams when meeting an obstacle, the intellectual heritage of the library found diverse routes forward when the institution itself could no longer serve as its vessel. Some of these paths were planned and deliberate. Others arose from historical accidents and unexpected cultural encounters. Together, they ensured that core achievements of Alexandrian scholarship would eventually reach us across a gulf of nearly 2 millennia. Even before the library's final decline, an important preservation mechanism had been established through the copying and distribution of texts. Throughout its operation, Alexandria had provided copies of important works to scholars and institutions across the Mediterranean world. Some were official gifts to other rulers or libraries. Others were made for visiting researchers to take home. Still others were created at the request of wealthy patrons willing to pay for personal copies of significant texts. This dispersal created a crucial redundancy. When disaster eventually struck Alexandria, many texts survived elsewhere in these distributed copies. Imagine a mathematical treatise composed in Alexandria during the 3rd century BCE. The original might remain in the library, but copies could travel to Athens, Rhodes, Pergamon, and eventually Rome. Each recipient might make further copies for colleagues or students. Over generations, dozens or even hundreds of copies might exist in locations throughout the Mediterranean, creating resilience against the loss of any single collection. While many ancient texts were indeed lost forever, this distribution mechanism helps explain why others survived despite the library's destruction. As political realities shifted during the late Hellenistic and Roman periods, Other centers of learning gained prominence and absorbed portions of the Alexandrian tradition. The library at Pergamon, established by the Attalid dynasty in deliberate competition with Alexandria, preserved many important texts. Athens remained an intellectual center, particularly for philosophy. Rhodes developed strengths in rhetoric and astronomy. Rome increasingly attracted Greek scholars who brought texts and teaching traditions from Eastern centers, including Alexandria. Each of these institutions maintained collections that overlapped with Alexandria's holdings, creating additional security through diversification. When Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, some portions of Alexandrian knowledge entered Roman intellectual life more directly. Wealthy Romans developed a fashion for private libraries stocked with Greek texts. Some may have acquired works directly from Alexandria through purchase, gift, or less scrupulous means. Roman authors like Vitruvius drew heavily on Alexandrian technical knowledge in fields from architecture to hydraulics. Medical writers incorporated the anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus. The Alexandrian approach to organizing and classifying knowledge influenced Roman encyclopedists like Pliny the Elder and Varro. As the Western Roman Empire declined in the 4th and 5th century CE, the Eastern or Byzantine Empire became increasingly important for preserving Greek knowledge, including the Alexandrian heritage. Constantinople, modern Istanbul, founded as the new imperial capital in 3030 CE, developed significant libraries that collected and preserved classical texts. Byzantine scholars maintained traditions of copying and commenting on ancient works throughout the medieval period, providing a crucial continuity for Greek learning even as Western Europe entered periods of political fragmentation and economic contraction. Picture a Byzantine scriptorium in the 9th century CE, a room in a monastery or palace where monks or secular scribes carefully copy ancient texts onto parchment codices. Working with quill pens and coloured inks, they reproduce works originally created in Alexandria 1,000 years earlier, perhaps Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, or medical texts drawing on Herophilian anatomy. These copyists might not fully understand all the technical content they reproduce, but their patient, meticulous work ensures these achievements are not lost to time. Perhaps the most crucial transmission path for Alexandrian knowledge came through the Islamic scholarly tradition that flourished after the 7th century CE. As Muslim civilization expanded and established new centers of learning, scholars recognized the value of Greek scientific and philosophical works. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, 750–258 CE, a remarkable translation movement centered in Baghdad systematically rendered Greek texts into Arabic, often via intermediate Syriac translations. This Arabic preservation phase proved essential for many Alexandrian works. Caliph al-Ma'mun established the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, in Baghdad around 830 CE, which became a center for translation and original research inspired by Alexandrian models. Muslim scholars did not simply preserve these texts, but engaged with them critically, correcting errors, resolving contradictions, and extending the original research. In fields like optics, astronomy, and medicine, they significantly advanced beyond their Alexandrian predecessors while maintaining the empirical, mathematical approach that characterized the best Alexandrian work. Imagine scholars working in Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba, surrounded by Arabic translations of Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen, extending these traditions through original observations and theoretical innovations. A physician might study anatomical concepts first documented by Herophilus, applying them in clinical settings and adding new observations. An astronomer might use Ptolemy's mathematical models while developing more accurate observational techniques. This was not mere preservation, but a living intellectual tradition that both honored and transcended its Alexandrian roots. As intellectual exchange between Islamic and Christian civilizations increased in the 12th–13th centuries, particularly in places like Toledo in Spain and Sicily under Norman rule, many Greek works preserved in Arabic were translated into Latin, making them accessible to European scholars. This process, often involving multiple translations, Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin, was imperfect and sometimes introduced errors or misunderstandings. Nevertheless, it succeeded in transmitting the core content of many essential Alexandrian works to medieval Europe, helping to lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. Beyond these major transmission paths, smaller streams carried fragments of Alexandrian knowledge through surprising routes. Egyptian Christians, Copts, preserved some Greek learning through their own scholarly traditions. Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean maintained interest in certain philosophical and scientific texts, creating Hebrew translations that sometimes preserved works lost in other languages. Eastern Christian communities in Syria, Armenia, and elsewhere kept particular traditions alive through their distinctive intellectual cultures. The physical form of texts evolved dramatically during these centuries of transmission. The papyrus scrolls of Ptolemaic Alexandria gave way to parchment codices, which were eventually supplemented by paper manuscripts after this Chinese invention reached the Mediterranean via the Islamic world. Each change in medium required deliberate copying efforts, creating both risks of loss and opportunities for wider distribution through more economical materials. By the time of the European Renaissance in the 14th–16th centuries, the scattered streams of Alexandrian knowledge began to reconverge. Renewed interest in classical learning led scholars to search monasteries for forgotten manuscripts, bring Greek texts from Byzantium, especially after the fall of Constantinople, to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and engage with Arabic scientific and philosophical traditions. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century transformed textual preservation once again, allowing much wider distribution of works that had survived through tenuous manuscript traditions. Consider which specific achievements in texts did survive this complex journey. Euclid's Elements. The systematic presentation of geometry that represented one of Alexandria's greatest intellectual monuments was preserved essentially complete, becoming one of the most influential textbooks in human history. Ptolemy's astronomical work in the Almagest survived to shape understanding of the cosmos until the Copernican revolution. Medical writings influenced by the Alexandrian empirical tradition, particularly through Galen's synthesis, guided healthcare for over a millennium. Hero's work on pneumatics and mechanics eventually contributed to the development of steam power and modern engineering. In contrast, many Alexandrian achievements survive only in fragmentary form or through secondary references. We know the anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus primarily through later authors quoting or discussing their work. Most of the library's vast literary collection, including countless works of drama, poetry, history, and philosophy, disappeared entirely or survives only in scattered quotations and references. The loss is particularly acute for unique items like the original eyewitness accounts of Alexander's campaigns written by participants, or complete copies of authors like Sappho, whose works now exist only in fragments. As you drift closer to sleep, reflect on this complex legacy, part triumph of preservation against tremendous odds, part tragedy of irreplaceable loss. The glass is both half full and half empty. We can celebrate the remarkable persistence of knowledge through wars, religious changes, political collapses, and technological transitions spanning nearly 2 millennia. Yet we must also acknowledge the silenced voices and lost wisdom that might have enriched our understanding had they survived. In a deeper sense, the true legacy of Alexandria lies not just in specific texts or discoveries that were preserved, but in a particular approach to knowledge that these surviving works embodied. The Alexandrian commitment to systematic observation, logical analysis, mathematical precision, careful documentation, and open inquiry, represents an intellectual methodology that transcended any particular discovery. When Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers rediscovered this approach through surviving texts, they were connecting not just with specific content, but with a way of understanding the world that remained powerful across millennia. The modern scientific method, library classification systems, textual criticism approaches, even the basic idea of the research university, all have roots that can be traced back to Alexandrian practices, transmitted imperfectly but recognizably through these complex preservation paths. When today's astronomers calculate celestial positions, when mathematicians build proofs from axioms, when librarians develop cataloging systems, or when philologists compare manuscript variants, they are participating in intellectual traditions with direct connections to practices first systematized in the Great Library over 2,000 years ago. As sleep begins to embrace you more fully, take comfort in this continuity of human understanding across time. Though buildings fall and institutions disappear, though papyrus crumbles and political orders change, the fundamental insights of human minds can find ways to persist, flowing like water around obstacles, sometimes underground for generations before re-emerging into the light. The story of Alexandria's legacy is not just about ancient achievements, but about the remarkable resilience of human knowledge when it becomes part of living intellectual traditions. And as we move toward our next section on modern understandings and myths about the library, carry with you this dual awareness of both profound loss and remarkable persistence. The library's story reminds us of knowledge's vulnerability to time and circumstance, yet also of its capacity to survive through unexpected channels when valued by successive generations. It is a story that continues to unfold, as modern scholarship discovers new fragments and connections that help us better understand this remarkable institution and its enduring influence. As sleep draws ever nearer, let us explore how the Great Library lives on in modern imagination and scholarship, how this ancient institution continues to evolve in our understanding, sometimes illuminated by new discoveries, sometimes obscured by persistent myths that reveal more about our own values than historical reality. For the Library of Alexandria has become not just a historical subject, but a powerful cultural symbol whose meaning continues to develop long after its physical destruction. Modern scholarly understanding of the library has advanced significantly in recent decades, though fundamental challenges remain. The most basic difficulty faced by researchers is the limited primary evidence. Unlike Pompeii or the Athenian Acropolis, no physical remains of the library have been definitively identified. Alexandria's ancient structures lie beneath the modern city or under the Mediterranean waters due to coastal subsidence and rising sea levels. Archaeological work continues in Alexandria, occasionally yielding tantalizing finds, like the remains of lecture halls that might have been associated with the Malseon, but nothing has conclusively revealed the library's exact location or structure. Written evidence presents its own challenges. No catalogue of the library's holdings has survived, not even fragments of Callimachus's famous Panarches. No administrative records detail its operations or acquisitions. No floor plans or architectural descriptions provide its exact dimensions or layout. Instead, researchers must piece together understanding from scattered references in various ancient texts, many written centuries after the library's heyday, and sometimes contradicting each other on key points. Despite these limitations, careful scholarly work has established certain facts with reasonable confidence. The distinction between the Malseon Research Institute and the library, collection of texts, is now well understood. The development of systematic textual criticism as a hallmark of Alexandrian scholarship has been thoroughly documented. The connection between political power and knowledge collection under the Ptolemies has been analysed from multiple perspectives. The pivotal role of Alexandria in preserving and transmitting Greek intellectual achievements to later civilizations has been traced through surviving texts. New methodological approaches have enriched our understanding in recent decades. Cultural historians have examined the library as an expression of Hellenistic values and power structures. Historians of science have analysed how institutional support at Alexandria enabled particular kinds of research and discovery. Book historians have studied the physical realities of text production and storage in the ancient world to better understand the library's operations. Archaeologists have used new technologies including ground-penetrating radar and underwater exploration to search for physical evidence beneath modern Alexandria. Alongside these scholarly advances, popular understanding of the library has been shaped by persistent myths and misconceptions that reveal our own preoccupations as much as historical reality. Perhaps most pervasive is the notion that the library's destruction represented a single catastrophic event that single-handedly ended ancient learning and plunged the world into dark ages of ignorance. This dramatic narrative appears in countless books, articles, and online discussions, despite historians' much more nuanced understanding of the library's gradual decline through multiple setbacks over centuries. The emotional appeal of this catastrophe myth is understandable. It offers narrative simplicity, a clear before and after, villains and victims, a dramatic turning point rather than slow institutional decay. It resonates with modern anxieties about cultural heritage destruction, whether through war, terrorism, or natural disaster. It provides a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge and civilization. Yet this simplification obscures the complex reality of how intellectual traditions actually persisted and evolved through multiple transmission paths despite the library's physical loss. Another persistent myth centers on exactly who destroyed the library and when. Different versions blame Julius Caesar, Christians under Theophilus, or Muslims under Caliph Omar, often reflecting contemporary political or religious tensions more than historical evidence. These competing destruction narratives have been weaponized in various cultural conflicts, used to indict Roman imperialism, Christian intolerance, or Islamic conquest, depending on the agenda of the writer. The historical reality of multiple partial destructions and gradual decline lacks the clear villains these narratives demand. The library has also become a powerful symbol in broader cultural conversations about knowledge and its preservation. It features prominently in discussions about digital archiving, with modern projects like the Internet Archive explicitly drawing inspiration from Alexandria's universalist ambitions. The library's destruction serves as a cautionary tale in conversations about cultural heritage preservation, digital data vulnerability, and the potential losses from climate change or political instability. These modern associations, while sometimes anachronistic, demonstrate the continuing resonance of the library as a cultural touchstone. Popular imagination has sometimes filled the gaps in historical knowledge with romanticized visions of the library that reveal modern preoccupations. Films, novels, and artwork often depict the library as a vast, cathedral-like space with soaring ceilings and endless rows of shelves. An image drawn more from modern libraries than ancient reality, where scrolls were typically stored in wall niches or cabinets rather than on freestanding shelves. The diverse Alexandrian scholarly community is sometimes portrayed with anachronistic diversity, reflecting contemporary values rather than ancient realities. These creative interpretations, while not historically accurate, keep the library alive in cultural memory and connect its story to ongoing human concerns. Scientific and academic communities have been particularly drawn to the library as a symbol. Carl Sagan memorably featured the library in his television series Cosmos, lamenting its destruction as a tragic setback for human knowledge, and speculating how much more advanced science might be had. Its contents survived. Academic institutions sometimes invoke Alexandria when discussing the ideals of comprehensive knowledge collection and interdisciplinary research. The very concept of the universal library, gathering all significant human knowledge in one place, continues to inspire projects from Wikipedia to various digital archiving initiatives. As your consciousness drifts toward deeper sleep, consider how archaeology and new technologies might yet enhance our understanding of the Great Library. Ongoing excavations in Alexandria occasionally yield surprises. Ancient lecture halls, scholarly instruments, fragments of texts. Advances in imaging technology allow researchers to read previously illegible papyri, sometimes recovering works thought lost forever. The discovery in 1896 of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a massive collection of texts from ancient Egypt, including many previously lost works, demonstrates how archaeological finds can dramatically expand our knowledge of ancient literature. The most significant modern advance in understanding the library may come not from finding its physical remains, but from recognizing its distributed legacy. The way its intellectual achievements survive through transmission paths we can now trace with greater clarity. By mapping how specific texts move through various languages and cultures, how scholarly methods were adopted and adapted in different contexts, and how fundamental discoveries continued to influence later thinkers, we gain a more complete picture of the library's true impact than could be achieved through physical excavation alone. Perhaps the most profound modern engagement with the library's legacy comes through recognizing both what was lost and what survived, maintaining the tension between these realities rather than resolving it into simple narratives of either complete destruction or seamless preservation. The partial survival of Alexandrian knowledge through complex, sometimes surprising transmission paths reminds us of both knowledge's vulnerability and its remarkable resilience when valued by successive generations. As sleep begins to embrace you more fully, let the Great Library settle in your imagination not as a simple historical fact, but as a multifaceted symbol whose meaning continues to evolve. It represents both magnificent achievement and tragic loss, both the heights of human intellectual ambition and the limitations imposed by historical circumstances. It serves as both inspiration for modern knowledge-gathering projects and cautionary tale about the fragility of cultural institutions. Like all powerful historical symbols, it continues to generate new meanings as each generation engages with its legacy from their own perspective. And as we transition to our penultimate section about the modern Bibliotheca, Alexandrina, the library built to honor and in some sense revive the ancient institution, carry with you this awareness of how the past lives in the present, how ancient achievements continue to inspire new creations, and how the story of human knowledge forms a continuous thread connecting us to those scholars who worked by lamplight among papyrus scrolls 2,000 years ago. As you drift in that gentle space between wakefulness and dreams, let us explore how the ancient library's legacy has found physical expression in our own time through the creation of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern institution built to honor the spirit of its ancient namesake while serving the needs of the contemporary world. For after centuries existing only in historical memory and cultural imagination, the Great Library has, in a sense, been reborn on the shores of the Mediterranean. The story of this modern revival began in the 1970s, when scholars at the University of Alexandria proposed creating a new library that would recapture the universal vision of the ancient institution. This concept gradually gained support from the Egyptian government, UNESCO, and international donors, evolving from an academic dream into a major architectural and cultural project. In 1988, President Hosni Mubarak laid the foundation stone, though construction would not begin in earnest until the mid-1990s due to funding challenges and design considerations. An international architectural competition attracted over 500 entries from around the world, with the winning design coming from the Norwegian firm Snohetta. Their vision captured something essential about both ancient inspiration and modern function. A circular main building partially submerged into the ground, its roof forming a massive tilted disc facing the Mediterranean Sea. This distinctive form evokes multiple symbolic associations: a rising sun of knowledge, an ancient sundial, a computer disk storing information, and perhaps most powerfully, the cyclical nature of knowledge lost and rediscovered across time. After years of construction and development, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina was inaugurated in October 2002, almost exactly 1600 years after the likely destruction of the Serapeum, which had housed the last significant remnant of the ancient library. The opening ceremonies brought together political leaders, scholars, artists, and writers from across the world to celebrate what UNESCO called the revival of the ancient Library of Alexandria, a project described as a link between the past, present, and future. Imagine approaching this remarkable structure along the Corniche, Alexandria's waterfront boulevard. The enormous tilted roof, covered in thousands of granite panels inscribed with characters from diverse world writing systems, catches the Mediterranean sunlight. Below, the building's exterior wall features carvings reminiscent of ancient hieroglyphs in cuneiform, yet rendered in abstract contemporary style. This visual language immediately establishes the institution's dual nature, rooted in ancient traditions while embracing modern global culture. Entering the main reading room reveals the building's most spectacular space, a vast circular hall rising through 7 terraced levels with capacity for 8 million books and 2,000 readers. Natural light floods the space through clerestory windows in the tilted roof, creating an environment that feels simultaneously monumental and inviting. This architectural achievement embodies the project's ambition to create not just a functional library, but a space that inspires awe and contemplation, connecting visitors to the intellectual ambitions of the ancient institution. Beyond the main library, the complex includes specialized facilities that reflect a comprehensive vision of knowledge reminiscent of the ancient Halcyon. There are dedicated libraries for children, young adults, and the visually impaired, a manuscript restoration and conservation laboratory, multiple museums covering ancient Egyptian civilization, science, and manuscripts, art galleries, a planetarium, and conference centers for scholarly meetings. This diversity of functions echoes the ancient institution's role as not merely a repository of texts, but a comprehensive center for learning and research. The Bibliotheca, Alexandrina's collections and programs reflect both respect for the past and engagement with contemporary knowledge needs. Special emphasis has been placed on preserving manuscripts and rare books from Egypt's multilingual heritage, Arabic, Coptic, and Greek materials that represent the continuous intellectual traditions of the region. Simultaneously, the library has pioneered digital initiatives, including web archiving, digitization projects, and open access repositories that extend its reach globally in ways the ancient scholars could never have imagined. Perhaps most significantly, the modern library explicitly embraces the cosmopolitan, cross-cultural spirit that characterized ancient Alexandria at its best. Its collections include works in scores of languages. Its cultural programs celebrate diverse traditions. Its research initiatives frequently involve international collaboration. In a region sometimes marked by political and religious tensions, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina has consistently promoted values of openness, tolerance, and intellectual freedom that honor the universalist vision of its ancient predecessor. This commitment has not been without challenges. Since its opening, the library has navigated complex political waters, maintaining intellectual independence through Egypt's revolution of 2011 and subsequent political changes. Like its ancient namesake, which operated under the patronage of rulers with their own political agendas, the modern institution must balance scholarly integrity with practical realities of funding and governance. That it has largely succeeded in this balancing act speaks to the powerful symbolic value placed on the library by diverse stakeholders. The relationship between the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina and its ancient inspiration is not one of simple recreation. The new institution does not pretend to be the old one resurrected. Rather, it represents a thoughtful engagement with the ancient library's legacy, asking what its universal vision of knowledge might mean in a digital age of information abundance rather than scarcity, where the ancient library sought to gather all significant texts in one physical location, an unprecedented ambition for its time. The modern institution recognizes that universal access may now be more important than universal collection. Visitors to the Bibliotheca Alexandrina often comment on the emotional impact of standing in a place that so consciously connects to events 2 millennia past. There is something deeply moving about watching readers work beneath that spectacular tilted roof, knowing they are participating in a tradition of scholarship that extends back to Euclid, Eratosthenes. The institution serves as a rare physical manifestation of cultural memory, a place where the abstract notion of intellectual heritage takes concrete form. For Alexandria itself, the library represents both a reclaiming of historical identity and an investment in future development. The ancient library was integral to the city's character and international standing. The modern institution similarly seeks to re-establish Alexandria as a cultural and intellectual center after periods of relative decline. Local students and scholars now have access to resources that connect them both to global knowledge networks and to their own rich heritage, creating educational opportunities that may yield future generations of researchers and thinkers. As you drift closer to sleep, consider what the creation of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina reveals about our contemporary relationship with the past. It represents neither simple nostalgia, a wish to return to an idealized ancient world, nor dismissal of historical models as irrelevant to modern concerns. Instead, it demonstrates how historical inspiration can be productively engaged with contemporary needs and technologies, creating something that honors tradition while serving the present. This balanced approach to cultural heritage offers a model for how we might think about other historical institutions and achievements. Rather than simply lamenting what has been lost or assuming we have surpassed the past, we can recognize continuities and disruptions, learning from earlier successes and failures while adapting principles to new contexts. The Great Library's legacy proves most valuable not when treated as a static historical fact, but as a living tradition that continues to evolve. As the Bibliotheca Alexandrina enters its 3rd decade, it continues to develop in ways its planners might not have anticipated. Digital initiatives have become increasingly central to its mission, with major projects to archive web content, digitize Arabic heritage, and create open educational resources. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this digital pivot, with online programming reaching audiences far beyond Egypt. Like its ancient predecessor, which evolved from Ptolemy I's initial vision through centuries of adaptation, the modern institution continues to reinterpret its mission in response to changing circumstances. What remains constant is the power of the library as a symbol of human intellectual ambition, of knowledge that transcends political and religious boundaries, of the desire to preserve and transmit understanding across generations. The ancient library has been transformed from historical institution to cultural touchstone, its significance extending far beyond the specific texts it once contained. In the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, this symbolic power finds physical expression, creating a space where visitors can connect tangibly with one of humanity's most enduring intellectual dreams. As we prepare for our final reflections on this journey through the Great Library's story, carry with you this image of rebirth and continuity, the circular form of the modern library's architecture, suggesting that even after destruction, knowledge has a way of returning, transformed yet recognizable, ready to inspire new generations of seekers and thinkers. The cycle from Ptolemy's original vision, through centuries of achievement and decline, to modern reinterpretation, reminds us that no ending is ever truly final when it comes to humanity's pursuit of understanding. As sleep beckons you into its gentle embrace, let us conclude our journey through the remarkable story of the Great Library of Alexandria with some final reflections, thoughts to carry with you as you drift toward dreams. For the library's tale offers more than historical knowledge. It provides profound perspective on human achievement, the vulnerability of civilization, and the enduring nature of our quest for understanding. The story of Alexandria reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is among humanity's noblest endeavors. In establishing the library, the early Ptolemaic rulers demonstrated rare foresight, investing immense resources not primarily in monuments to their own glory, but in an institution that would outlast them by centuries. The scholars who gathered there, cataloguing, preserving, comparing, questioning, and discovering, exemplified the finest qualities of human curiosity. Their patient, methodical work expanded the boundaries of understanding in fields from mathematics to medicine, astronomy to literary criticism, creating intellectual foundations that in many cases remain relevant today. There is something deeply reassuring in this continuity of human inquiry across millennia. When a modern mathematician works with geometric principles first systematized by Euclid, when an astronomer uses concepts developed by Ptolemy, when a physician employs anatomical knowledge that can be traced back to Herophilus, they participate in an unbroken tradition of rational investigation. The specific tools and techniques evolve, but the essential questions and approaches show remarkable persistence. This suggests something fundamental about our nature as a species, that the desire to understand our world and ourselves transcends the boundaries of time, culture, and circumstance. Yet the library's fate also offers a sobering reminder of fragility. An institution that represented the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement, that gathered resources beyond anything previously attempted, that housed irreplaceable cultural treasures. This marvel of human creation proved vulnerable to political change, religious conflict, economic constraints, and physical destruction. The fires that damaged collections, the gradual withdrawal of institutional support, the shifting priorities that allowed unique texts to deteriorate beyond recovery, all remind us that no achievement, however magnificent, is guaranteed permanence. This awareness need not lead to despair, but rather to a deeper appreciation for the precious nature of human culture and the importance of its preservation. The partial survival of Alexandrian knowledge through multiple transmission paths demonstrates that preservation is possible even under difficult circumstances when enough people value what might otherwise be lost. Each time a text was carefully copied, each time knowledge was taught to a new generation, each time wisdom was translated into a new language, individuals were performing essential work that allowed Alexandrian achievements to transcend the institution's physical destruction. The library also offers perspective on our place in time. When we consider that Euclid wrote his Elements approximately as far in the past from us as we are from the construction of the great cathedrals of Europe, we begin to grasp the vast sweep of human time. We are not separate from the ancients. We are their continuation. The questions they asked are the questions we still ask. What is the nature of the cosmos? How do we live a good life? What can we know, and how do we know it? As you lie in bed now, letting your breath slow and your mind settle, consider this: you are part of this long chain. When you read, when you wonder, when you preserve a memory or pass on a story, You are participating in the same noble endeavour that lit the lamps of Alexandria. That ancient flame, thought long extinguished, still flickers in the quiet moments of reflection and learning. In your curiosity, in your love of understanding, in your awe of the stars or the written word, you keep the library alive. The Library of Alexandria was not a building, it was a promise. A promise that knowledge is worth seeking, that truth is worth preserving, that the human mind, fragile as it may be, can reach across centuries and whisper to itself, "You are not alone. Others came before, others will come after." Let that thought cradle you now, as sleep gently overtakes your thoughts. You are not a solitary soul drifting in darkness. You are a thread in the great woven fabric of human longing for truth, for meaning, for understanding. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with light.